Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Christina Finch. I'm the head of the Tolerance and Non-Discrimination Department at ODIHR, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Working Session 13, Tolerance and Non-Discrimination, including combating racism, xenophobia, and discrimination, combating anti-Semitism and discrimination against Christians, Muslims, and members of other religions. The session will last 3 hours. The first 30 minutes will be dedicated to opening words and remarks from our introducer and the chair and office's 3 personal representatives on tolerance. The list is full for speaker interventions. And as always, in the plenary hall, there are designated signs placed on the table. Please respect the speaking arrangement throughout the session. I would note that live streaming of the 2019 HGIM is available. Filming with cameras and video cameras is only permitted by accredited journalists and only during the opening and closing plenary sessions. No other audio-visual recordings should be undertaken without the explicit permission of individuals being recorded. Please note that we do have a reserve list. We know that the list is full. We will try to make it to the reserve list, but again, it's a very full session. And so I would welcome participants to submit written statements to our documents and records management team for distribution. Let me turn now to our introducer for this session, Imam Yahya Palavicini. The Imam is a European Muslim citizen resident of Rome. He's the president and Imam of the Cores Italian Islamic religious community, one of the principal organizations of institutional representation of the Islamic religion in Italy, with a vocation for theological training, ecumenism, and intercultural education. Imam, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Distinguished delegates of OSCE member states, distinguished representatives of international and civil society organizations, participants of the Youth Forum, and dear ladies and gentlemen, let me first of all thank OSCE and ODIHR, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, for their kind invitation to present an introduction to the important issues of this session on combating racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and discrimination against Christians, Muslims, and members of other religions. The universal values of every civilization are under attack by aggressive minorities of some countries, of citizens who are determined to deny other European and foreign citizens the fundamental right to live in accordance with their cultural and religious identity. These ideological minorities who exploit the freedom of opinion for psychological provocation and who bend the democratic system to make it fit their idea of political exclusivism are intent on revolutionizing contemporary society by imposing a narrative of hatred towards all forms of cultural and religious diversity. At the juridical level, the lobbies of these movements tend to deny the organized representatives of cultural and religious minorities any right of citizenship and integration, imposing cultural homologation with the claim that Western identity should remain exclusive and unmarried. Their racism follows 20th century ideologies on the purity and impurity of races, and they claim that their fundamentalism is the only model of the so-called superiority of Western civilization, while promoting liberation from all other philosophical, cultural, and spiritual interpretations developed throughout the history of humanity. Keywords such as legally incompatible or culturally foreign have become verdicts of this modern court of the Inquisition, which exacerbates the demonization of cultural and religious differences and even denies the universal heritage of the multiple identities of faith and thought that have contributed to the intellectual and scientific progress of humanity. The political propaganda of these movements swings between the apology of a sectarian and exclusive solution and the denial of any dignity of thought and worship that is not associated with its own ideological monologue. Other methods of communication envisage interpretations that falsify religious doctrines and cultural matrices, hence generating myths of false dangers that jeopardize the freedom, well-being, and health of the people of the nation. A dark fascination seems to charm and stimulate the minds of some few violent young people and adults who have been trained to purify their neighborhoods of foreigners or minorities of Jews and Muslims who have been respectable citizens of European society for generations. They attack their cemeteries, tombstones, private schools, businesses, synagogues, churches, and mosques, and the homes of the members of these communities. Episodes of vulgarity, hatred, and psychological, physical, and even personal violence are becoming increasingly common in many cities in Europe. Discriminatory actions undermining the right to work or to educate or health and the freedom to organize and practice one's religion based on the identity or cultural origin of the family or religious affiliation are on the increase in many European states. Alternatively, foreign citizens, together with believers of different religious denominations, seem to be the object of special concessions where they have access to the benefit of some rights, but according to standards which are different from those of the normal citizen. And in any case, they are in fact excluded from equal opportunities and the fullness of rights and that every man and woman should enjoy. To justify the narrative of these discriminatory attitudes, three recurring themes against cultural and religious pluralism are mainly used: influx of migrants and refugees from territories in conflict or that are poverty-stricken, international security against terrorism, and the condition of women. Statistical surveys on the alleged invasion of citizens and believers from Asia and Africa are biased to prompt the defense of the Western race and preference for the migration of only Christian workers. The criminal conduct and male chauvinism of the subversive groups is adroitly confused with the identity of communities, which instead are the victims and hostages of these terrorist manipulations. Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, and Hindu citizens have nothing to do with criminals who confuse nationalism with false religious wars and who ignore the perspective of the sacredness of life taught by the prophets. On the contrary, the civil commitment of religious leaders and citizens of all faith communities, together with the democratic institutions in each state of Europe, are evidence of the success of the ecumenical, interreligious, intra-religious, intercultural, and interdisciplinary model of defense of the dignity and rights of religious pluralism. For years, MJLC, the Council of Muslim and Jewish Leaders of Europe, has developed a network of fraternal collaboration in the fight against anti-Semitism and against the discrimination of Muslim religious minorities. The recent MJLC assembly held in Matera, capital city of European culture, set up some working groups, among which one on religious freedom in interaction with the institutions of the European Union, and one on the defense of kosher and halal food precepts, ensuring full protection of animal well-being. The testimony of European rabbis and imams who worked together to protect the authenticity of doctrinal interpretations from erroneous misinterpretations confirmed the responsibility of the authoritative representatives of religious minorities in building unity within the diversity of the European program. Any misunderstanding by Europe of the added value of religious pluralism would undermine the history and identity of Europe itself, on a spiritual, political, cultural, and social level, and would create only chaos. At the same time, thanks to the cooperation of international organizations in Europe in support of interreligious and intercultural dialogue such as CAICID, it has been possible to set up intra-religious cooperation and training networks among Muslims in Europe, such as the Awlima Council. Some of its members have actively participated in the work inspired by the recent Abu Dhabi Declaration signed by Pope Francis and Imam Ahmed al-Tayyib on human fraternity. Training programs and programs to prevent radicalism, together with integration projects on democratic citizenship and religious freedom in the fields of education, health, and also international trade, are solutions of great faithfulness for the cohesion and familiarity between people and cultures. Shared ethics and the pursuit of achieving the common good bring together citizens and institutions, believers of different cultures and different political positions. The future of Europe and the protection of its roots and identity from all irrational and totalitarian extremism depend on this enlightened cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Imam Palavicini. I now would like to introduce Rabbi Andrew Baker, the Chair in Office's personal representative on combating anti-Semitism. Rabbi Baker, the floor is yours.
Thank you. These are difficult times. In a month, we will mark the anniversary of the mass killings at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and notably the worst anti-Semitic incident in U.S. history. We fully expect that when American Jews next week go to synagogue for the holidays, they will see an unprecedented level of security in their buildings. What has long been the norm for Jews in Europe has now crossed the Atlantic. In the United Kingdom, Jews have reacted with growing alarm to a British Labour Party whose leadership seems not only to condone anti-Semitism within its midst, but actively promotes anti-Semitic messages which frequently illustrate how anti-Zionism is sometimes just a mask for anti-Semitism. The party has now announced that it will convene a special meeting to address the problem of anti-Semitism, but it will do so on a Saturday, thus ensuring that Jewish Labour Party members themselves will not be part of that discussion. Right-wing populist parties for whom anti-Semitism is a prominent component are making unprecedented gains in well-established democracies. When Alternative for Germany secured a strong second-place finish in two recent German state elections, many observers were actually relieved, having feared that that party would win the most seats in those regional parliaments. But AfD, with its xenophobic and anti-Semitic platform, will be around for a while. FRA, the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, released its second and expanded survey of experiences and perceptions of Jews in the EU last December. And while fully half of those surveyed believe their governments recognize the seriousness of the problem, nearly 3/4 say it doesn't make any difference in combating anti-Semitism. That survey also pointed out another difficult truth. The largest percentage of anti-Semitic incidents were identified as coming from individuals who hold an Islamist ideology. And available data tell us that on average, Muslims in Europe may hold more negative views of Jews than that of the general population. So we must find the practical tools to change these attitudes. We have seen continued efforts in some countries to ban ritual circumcision and religious slaughter, elemental obligations for both Jews and Muslims since biblical times. Legislation prohibiting kosher slaughter has been enacted in Belgium, home to one of Europe's most significant Orthodox Jewish communities. For now, the community's only recourse is an appeal to the courts to overturn the law. If they lose, Jews may decide they have no alternative but to leave. Only yesterday, I was in Vilnius, Lithuania, joining with Holocaust survivors with political leaders, with the leader of the Jewish community and other dignitaries at the National Holocaust Commemoration Day ceremony in Ponari Forest, where in 1943, where in 1943, Vilnius Jews were murdered and buried in mass graves. But in Lithuania, as in other countries in the region, Holocaust history appears to be under review and open to distortion, if not outright denial. This summer, the mayor of Vilnius acted to remove a public plaque and change a street name that honored two wartime figures who were complicit in the persecution and murder of Lithuanian Jews. It was the right thing to do, but not without controversy. Hundreds of protesters demanded that the honor of these Nazi collaborators be restored. And all this, by way of anecdotal example, illustrates the problems we face as we continue our efforts to combat anti-Semitism. There is a long and productive record of the OSCE and ODIHR stepping up to the challenge. From our first conferences in 2003 and 2004, to the seminal Berlin Declaration and subsequent OSCE ministerial decisions and declarations. It includes numerous commitments by the participating states, a Department on Tolerance and Non-Discrimination at ODIHR, which has developed practical tools and training methods to combat anti-Semitism. Most recently, we have seen the outcome of Words into Action to address anti-Semitism, a special project which offers governments important guidelines and advice, especially when it comes to Jewish community security and to the role of education. The OSCE has long been in the forefront of the fight against anti-Semitism, but we are not alone. Last December, the European Council adopted its own declaration with clear recommendations for EU member states. In 2016, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance adopted the working definition of anti-Semitism, a critical tool in understanding the full and complex nature of the problem, and it too considers the fight against anti-Semitism now one of its core objectives. Only days ago, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief issued the first ever UN Human Rights Report focused exclusively on the problem of anti-Semitism, and offered a series of recommendations for the UN and for its member states to implement. We should be pleased to have these allies alongside us, but they should not cause us to withdraw our own focus. The problem of anti-Semitism requires all our efforts. Looking ahead, we need to build on the Words into Action project to make full use of the reach and the resources that are unique to the OSCE and to ODIHR. We know the Slovak chairmanship began this year with a high-level conference on anti-Semitism, which also offered broad recommendations for work to do. Various participating states are determined to provide the financial and political support for this work, and I very much hope that the incoming Albanian chairmanship will follow in this path. There is much we have done, but still much left to do. The needs are real and pressing, and I know that the interventions that are about to come in the remaining hours of this plenary from participating states, and especially from civil society, will make this clear. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Baker. I would now like to introduce Professor Ingeborg Gabriel, who is the Chair in Office's Special Representative on combating racism, xenophobia, and discrimination, also focusing on intolerance and discrimination against Christians and members of other religions. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Your Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. As has already been said, my mandate is basically two-pronged because it is not only religious citizens that are discriminated against. The burning questions of racism, xenophobia, and discrimination demand a high degree of priority. It is more than clear that the active practice of tolerance requires an ethical education not only of children, but of all citizens, an intensification of dialogues between ethnic and religious communities, as well as social and legal conditions that make this possible. The process of social integration must be based on laws anchored in human rights, mainly in freedom of speech and assembly, as well as in the freedom of religion and belief, and their effective implementation by the judiciary in all countries of OSCE. To put such guarantees in place is truly a gigantic task. OSCE institutions, and particularly ODIHR, are to be complimented on the work they are doing to this effect. It does make a big difference for the lives of concrete human beings whether there is less or more tolerance, even if there is never perfection. It is of paramount importance for them whether non-discrimination and goodwill prevail in a society. The practice of attitudes of decency, however, seems to become less widespread by the day. The reasons for this are manifold and cannot be reflected on here. However, this should be a motive for decisive action, creative ideas, and reflections on how to improve the situation. Social polarizations caused by discrimination, negative stereotyping, and the overemphasis on one's own ethnic, national, and religious identity always threaten social and political cohesions. Measures of integration and dialogue, often for concrete people to take up a focus of the Slovak presidency, are thus anything but marginal for the future of our multicultural and multi-religious societies. Experience shows that the opportunity to meet, know, and better understand what the others think and feel can help to overcome ignorance, prejudice, and even hatred. To dialogue means to open one's heart to the other with esteem and empathy. It would be naive to think that this can solve all problems. However, civil society initiatives that encourage the encounter between peoples weave threads for the future, to use a nice phrase of Pope Francis. Shrinking spaces for civil society, on the other hand, are a threat to integration, social peace, and cohesion, as are discriminatory measures against minorities. It is in this context that the violations of the rights of Christians are also to be focused on. Unfortunately, they are substantively growing also in the OSCE region. And there are two dimensions to this which are to be mentioned. In countries where human rights standards are in generally weak, as in some Central Asian states, Christians as well as Jehovah's Witnesses are disproportionately affected, e.g. by charges of terrorism under the pretext of security and other violations of FORB. If Christians are suppressed in a context, you can be confident that other minorities will be too. Human rights are independent and inseparable. It is therefore incoherent to downgrade human rights in favor of traditional values and at the same time champion the rights of Christians. Secondly, in countries with adequate legal and administrative standards, the number of hate crimes against Christians is also on the rise. It is part of growing social polarizations that churches are vandalized as well as religious objects and attacks of religious personnel. Thus, the French Ministry of the Interior reported more than 1,000 hate crimes with anti-Christian bias in 2018. So this is a considerable number, taking into consideration that many cases go unreported, showing that crimes against Christians are unfortunately no longer a marginal phenomenon. The perpetrators come from different ideological backgrounds. In addition to this, the highly precarious situation of asylum seekers of Christian faith needs to be mentioned, since the non-recognition of their claims can lead to truly life-threatening situations for them when deported to their countries. Ladies and gentlemen, in view of the negative effects of discrimination and xenophobia, we have to think about new instruments to combat the surge in intolerance. Let me conclude with the following suggestions. There is the need to increase religious literacy. Here, specific training of officials might be helpful, also as a tool for an effective implementation of FORB. There is a need to include religious actors, not only leaders, more extensively into civil society activities. Religious communities are functionally part of civil societies and should be brought on the board. In this context, also a strong focus on OSCE partnership countries could be helpful. Thirdly, there is a need to combat multidimensional discriminations, particularly where women and sexual minorities are concerned. The enhancement of the respect for the other has been part of OSCE's vision of universal humanism from its very beginnings. It constitutes a precondition for peaceful human relations among and within states. The present situation asks for a forceful response and a strengthening of the third dimension. Though times are becoming more difficult, there is still space of action. What is needed is political will, wisdom, and creativity, which stimulate the hope that respect, love, and justice will prevail over hatred and violence. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Gabriel. I would like to now introduce the Chair in Office's personal representative on combating intolerance and discrimination against Muslims, Ambassador Mehmet Pachichi. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Distinguished representatives of participating states of the OSCE and civil society, it's an undeniable fact that the discrimination, intolerance, and hate crime cases against Muslims are on increase within the OSCE region. According to the independent hate crime reports for 2018, they are almost doubled in many countries comparing the previous year. One should also notice that Muslim women constitute the majority of the victims as a vulnerable group that face multiple discrimination. Now, it is not difficult at all to observe that discriminative discourse against Muslims shows and repeats itself in many fields of life, from politics to press and social media, from education to administration and legislation in many different forms, using the same hate language. White supremacism turns its hate rhetoric against Muslims into an anti-Muslim populist ideology, and it eventually paves the way to the emergence of actual violence against Muslims. Unfortunately, the violent events show up more frequently and remain, however, mostly underreported. Nativist and anti-Muslim hate speech and behavior that have already penetrated into many areas of life, with its high potentiality of falling into violence, fortunately is to find in front of them the law and order, constitutional system, and the commitment to the fundamental human rights and freedoms on which our democratic institutions have established. Bearing in mind the given facts above, I would like to repeat here the two crucial points for combating the discrimination and intolerance against Muslims under the roof of the OSCE and ODIHR that are committed to implementation of the fundamental human rights and freedoms. The first one is the secure basis of the democratic institutions and constitutional system and law and order based on the fundamental human rights and freedom, on which all participating states have a strong consensus. The repeated declarations and documents produced by the OSCE participating states in the course of the OSCE's long history, and the programs conducted by ODIHR are clear proof of this. At the beginning of everything, the commitment of the participating states to fundamental rights enables us to label a hate crime against Muslims as well as other religious groups as a hate crime, and this commitment itself constitutes the main barrier in front of the normalization of the discriminative, xenophobic, and intolerant discourse circulated by extremist ideologies. Key terms of the far-right populist and white supremacist ideological rhetoric that associates Muslims as a monolithic group with being intolerant, non-rational, and incompatible with modern values, etc., only can be possible to be marked as xenophobic populism, discrimination, intolerance, negative stereotyping, hate speech and crime, incitement to violence with the commitment to fundamental rights of freedom of religion or belief. The second crucial need for encountering intolerance and discrimination against Muslims is that they are to be properly recognized, addressed, monitored, and recorded by the government, institutions, and the civil society. Without proper monitoring and reporting, set aside under recording, many hate crimes might be regarded as not existent at all. It is the data provided by reports that constitute an assertive reason and tangible content for programs for police, prosecutors, judges, the civil society, and other international organizations conducted by the OSCE and ODIHR to help ensure that participating states can properly recognize, define, and confront hate crimes against Muslims. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Pacici. I will now turn to the speakers list. Speaking time today will be limited to 2 minutes. I will have to be very strict about the 2 minutes so that we can make it through the speakers list. Sir, if actually you could turn your mic off for a moment, thank you. Let me remind participants that all interventions should be presented in a meaningful, orderly, and respectful manner. Observing the time limit and focusing on recommendations, please lead with the recommendations first, and please make sure your intervention is related to the topic of the session. Please keep comments brief and to the point, again, starting with recommendations relating to the session's topic. Criticism is welcome, but should be constructive. Please do not read lengthy prepared statements. If you have a prepared statement, however, please do submit it to the interpreter before you take the floor. And again, a reminder that participants can distribute their statements via the document distribution desk to ensure that the flow of documents can reflect the discussion here today. I would remind participants that they can only speak in the capacity in which they are registered, and only entities registered on the speakers list can take the floor. Finally, I would like to remind representatives of the participating states that points of order can only be related to procedural issues. When it comes to the substance of the matter under discussion, we welcome you to use your right of reply. With that, I will turn to the speakers list. The first speaker on the list is Cesner Center for Studies on New Religions, which will be followed by European Federation for Freedom of Belief. Cesner, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ms. Chairperson. The religious persecution in China has generated a number of refugees coming to participating states. My statement is about refugees in Italy. They come from various religions, but most of them from one heavily persecuted Christian new religious movement, the Church of Almighty God. We have heard in this room criticism of participating states for their handling of such refugees, but I believe we should also consider good practices which can serve as an example for other states. And in the last year, the Italian authorities have taken some positive steps to help the refugees from the Church of Almighty God, particularly through the National Commission for the Right to Asylum at the Ministry of Internal Affairs. They took 3 positive steps. First, they distributed a brochure to all the territorial commission with updated information. Second, they introduced lessons about persecution in China in the formation of the members of the Commission. And third, in March and July 2019, they produced new COI, country of origin information, specifically about the Church of Almighty God. That didn't solve all the problems. The government produced good documents. They are not always followed at the local level. But I believe that the general attitude of the Italian government answering some criticism even in this room has been positive, and I believe other countries should do something similar and take this positive example. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to European Federation for Freedom of Belief, to be followed by Human Rights Without Frontiers.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alessandro Micarelli. I'm a human rights lawyer specializing in freedom of religion and belief, and I represent the European Federation for Freedom of Belief. We are very thankful to the OSCE as you give space to the civil society to take part in this meeting. We are a secular entity. We are a member of the International Religious Freedom Movement, and we are in contact with several like-minded organizations, and we also are in contact with a number of public bodies around the world. We really appreciate the efforts of the United States of America, especially the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who had the great idea to launch the Ministerial to Advance Religious Freedom in the World, which gathered experts and representatives from some 87 countries last year in the first edition and more than 100 this year. In this way, persuading many states to, also OSCE participant states, to actively advance religious freedom in their territories. There is a problem sometimes with organizations combating and fighting against groups called sects, or generally speaking, minority groups. It's very interesting that some OSCE participant states like Italy, the United Kingdom, the United States of America, a few others, adopted legislation to look into the problem of spreading hatred via the internet and the social media. So we call on all the member states of the OSCE to look into this kind of initiatives like some countries did, and so to transform the problem of hate speech on the media into something positive for all minorities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I turn now to Human Rights Without Frontiers, to be followed by Coordinación de Association et de Particulars pour la Liberté de Conscience.
Thank you very much. Human Rights Without Frontiers does not defend any religion or belief system, but defends the right of individuals to believe or not to believe. Whether they believe in the teachings of Jesus Christ, Mohammed, Hare Krishna, Rudolf Steiner, or Ron Hubbard, it is their personal choice, and this choice is protected by international standards. Germany fails to respect this individual right when it stigmatizes and discriminates against people who believe in the teachings of Ron Hubbard. In Bavaria and a few other German Länder, the authorities use what they call sect filters. When someone applies for a public job, a public service contract, or a government bid. These sect filters contain questions exclusively targeting the possible affiliation or relationship of the candidate with Scientology. If so, the candidacy will be disqualified, and so will it be if the applicant refuses to fill in the questionnaire. This is not only intrusive and discriminatory, but this gravely violates the international human rights standards and stigmatizes the followers of Ron Hubbard as sub-citizens. His teachings are not banned in Germany, and spreading them is not a criminal activity. Therefore, their followers should not be treated differently from the followers of the Bible, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, the Buddhist, or any other teachings. Human Rights Without Frontiers strongly recommends that the German government immediately ban the sect filter practice and request the assistance of the OSCE ODIHR in this matter. I had to cut an important part of my paper, but it is available on the website of the OSCE ODIHR. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now turn to the next speaker on the list. You know who you are, fantastic. To be followed by the Center for Conservation of Indian Culture, Sri Prakash Dam.
Thank you. During the last OSCE session on freedom of religion or belief, we exposed the harmful activities of FECRIS, the European Federation of Centers of Research and Information on Cults and Sects, in Russia, and its integral financing by the French government. Members of FECRIS and of its Russian branch, the St. Irenaeus of Lyon Center for Religious Studies, which is affiliated to the Orthodox Church, have been waging for years a campaign against non-Orthodox minorities in order to eradicate them from the Russian territory. Alexander Dworkin, Vice President of FECRIS and Director of the St. Irenaeus of Lyon Center, is the major spokesperson and activist in this campaign against religious minorities in Russia. The situation of religious minorities has worsened during the last years with the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses, the harassment of the Hindus community, and others. FECRIS claims in its bylaws that its activities do not enter the religious field and declares to be neutral in this matter. How is it then that the Vice President of FECRIS, an organization registered in secular France and massively financed by the French state, is Alexander Dworkin, a Russian citizen blessed, financed, and missioned by the Russian Orthodox Church Patriarch to combat religious minorities perceived as competitors? We therefore ask the French government to cease its support to FECRIS and its harmful activities in Russia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now turn to the next speaker on the list, the Center for Conservation of the Indian Culture, Sri Prakash Dam, to be followed by the Church of Scientology in Hungary.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. The Center for Conservation of Indian Culture in Russia, Sri Prakash Dam, has been working on the front of spreading knowledge about Indian culture and helping the Indian citizens that live in Russia. We have presence in countries like India, Germany, Lithuania, UK, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. Our NGO is headed by the leader of Hinduism in Russia, who is also a popular spiritual teacher with a discipleship running in hundreds of thousands. Hinduism has got 140,000 followers in Russia and more than 1 billion worldwide. The Russian constitution mentions clearly that there should not be any one official religion on the territory of Russian Federation. At the same time, the influence of Orthodox Christianity is visible with naked eyes. Alexander Dworkin, who heads a Moscow-based research center for the study of sects and cults, is a notorious figure who attacks all except Orthodox Christianity through his defamation campaigns, which involve the use of methods labeled as extremist under the Russian constitution and law. Since the past 4 years, Dworkin has been concentrating his malicious efforts on Sri Prakashji. In the year 2017, his threats and hatred speeches directed towards the leader of Hinduism in Russia resulted in the burning of his effigy in New Delhi in front of the Russian embassy. Hindus do not have even one proper temple for their religious practices, except for the ashram that has been organized by Sri Prakashji in Moscow region. Nationalists and Dworkin's journalists regularly disturb the religious gatherings of Hindus. I have spoken on this grave matter in the walls of the UN and the Russian parliament. The problem will be solved only when the Russian government officially recognizes Hinduism and sanctions the building of the first Hindu temple. Dworkin and his associates, in the case of Sri Prakashji and his Hindu followers, are constantly violating the basic human rights and fundamental freedoms that are key to OSCE's comprehensive security concept. Legal sanctions must be taken against Dworkin by the OSCE and Russian agencies, banning his entry into EU and US. Dworkin is a threat
Thank
to
you
a
very
harmonious and
much.
peaceful
I now
society.
give the floor to the next speaker, the Church of Scientology in Hungary, to be followed by the Church of Scientology Public Affairs and Human Rights Office.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Distinguished panel and distinguished participants, in the annotated agenda of this session, there was a question raised. How are OEC participating states ensuring the implementation of the OEC commitments on tolerance and non-discrimination with regard to combating racism, xenophobia, and discrimination, anti-Semitism, intolerance, and discrimination against Christians, Muslims, and members of other religions. Being Hungarian, it is good that I can say that the Hungarian government is indeed taking measures to combat discrimination in some fields. For example, Prime Minister Orban proclaimed zero tolerance on anti-Semitism in July 2018 during the visit of Israeli Prime Minister to Budapest. Then in November last year, during the visit of His Excellency Samuel Brownback, United States Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, the Hungarian Prime Minister again emphasized the importance of freedom of religion. We can also observe the efforts of the Hungarian government to help persecuted Christians in different zones of the world. At the same time, there are religious minorities who are suffering from overt or covert religious discrimination in Hungary, including the Church of Scientology. OEC ODIHR invested tremendous effort and did a great job compiling, publishing freedom of religion or belief and security policy guidance. Looking through the document, one of the most recurring words is dialogue. We also believe that dialogue between governments and religious denominations could play a crucial role in preventing discrimination and hate. We would like to ask OECE participating states to set a good example of starting dialogue between government officials and religious groups in order to raise understanding of different religious groups, including the Church of Scientology and other new religious movements and minorities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker on the list, the Church of Scientology, Public Affairs and Human Rights Office, which will be followed by DIVA, Parents for Diversity.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. We kindly recommend OSCE, ODIHR, the EU, the US, and others to help us convince Germany to cease their discriminatory practices and enter into an honest dialogue with the Church of Scientology. According to OSCE guidelines, state permission may not be made a condition for the exercise of the freedom of religion or belief, and it cannot be made subject to prior registration or other similar procedures, since it belongs to human beings and communities. While the German representative dared to state here that Germany does not recognize Scientology as a religious community, but otherwise, her very courts have found the opposite in 30 and more court decisions, explicitly confirming either its idealistic and non-commercial nature or its religious nature, and therefore the protection granted to the Church and its members under Article 4 of the German Constitution. Some examples confirming the above are first in Hamburg, the State Admin Court of Appeal in 94, in Baden-Württemberg in 95, the Supreme Admin Court in 97, again Baden-Württemberg Admin Court of Appeal in 2003, the Hamburg Admin Court of Appeal in 2004, the Bavarian Admin Court of Appeal in 2005, the Federal Supreme Admin Court in 2005, Admin Court Bavaria in 2008, Berlin Admin Court in 2009, supported by State Admin Court, and more and more and more, which confirm the Church of Scientology or its members are entitled to the protection of religious freedom. Similar conclusions of religious recognition have been reached by the US, the Supreme Court of the UK, courts of Spain, Italy, Holland, Belgium, the ECHR, governments of Sweden, Portugal, Canada, etc., etc. Germany doesn't require citizens to declare if they hold Christian ideas because of certain abuses that have occurred in the world, or Muslim ideas because of Muslim beliefs in Sharia. But oddly enough, with the practice of sect filters, it demands citizens as a requisite to enter into many types of contract with government agencies at different levels to declare that they are not related to Scientology. Despite conclusion of the confirmed religiosity of Scientology, Germany continues...
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to DIVA, Parents for Diversity, to be followed by Bivgang Gleich Molikten for All.
Thank you. Fellow delegates and representatives, I join you today from Finland as a representative of DIVA, Parents for Diversity, an organization that works with families to promote diversity in schools and preschools. We work with and advocate for school children belonging to ethnic or religious minorities whose rights have been neglected or who are experiencing harassment and discrimination. Our statement today is also supported by 4 other NGOs working on issues of diversity inclusion in Finnish society. We are here to talk about the situation for ethnic and religious minority students in schools in Finland. Research has shown that immigrant, ethnic, and religious minority children and youth experience harassment, discrimination, and physical violence in schools at a considerably higher rate than their native-born and ethnic majority peers. Furthermore, children experience discrimination not only at the hands of their peers, but also from their school teachers and in the form of culturally uninformed curricula. School staff members lack basic knowledge about the nature and forms of racism and discrimination and often perpetuate such discrimination without even understanding it. As you might be aware, according to recent reports, Finland is topping the chart among EU countries in terms of experiences of racial harassment. Finland has also been found to have alarmingly poor results when it comes to the integration of migrant students in education. This is a serious problem because access to safe and equitable education is a significant determinant of future well-being and inclusion in society. In Finland, civil rights for minorities are formally guaranteed at the state level in the national curriculum for education, but at the level of municipalities who are actually in charge of organizing schools and providing education, they are neglected. The minority and immigrant families who face discrimination are left alone to fight with municipal authorities in court and are forced to take on the significant financial burden of obtaining legal representation. The process often takes years, during which the children continue to attend the same school where the discrimination goes on. To address this, we recommend the establishment of a supervising authority for the schools to ensure the implementation of the curriculum, children's rights, human rights, and to guarantee equality, equity, and justice for all children and families throughout schools. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to the next speaker on the list, Bivgang Gleich Mokleiken for All, to be followed by Core Issues Trust.
Madam Moderator, Director, dear colleagues, Possibilities for All is the name of my organization. Now, I would appeal to delegations of participating states to cease to persecute Muslims who hold to their faith. They want to be able to send their children to school in the clothing that is called upon by the dress code of Islam. In many post-secondary institutions, Muslims can study in hijabs. That isn't going to turn Europe into an Islamic state. The Islamic State of Uzbekistan, there are police officers who swear on the Quran that they won't take bribes. But we have Karimov who destroyed the Uzbek nation. I mean, it looks to me like we're in North Korea. So let's move away from this image of the great leader and let's have a truly democratic state. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now move on to Core Issues Trust, to be followed by Serbia.
Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Aleksandra Leśnik and I am from Poland and I am a supporting member of Core Issues Trust UK. I would like to call on the OSCE to consider the following recommendations: that the state supported and protected the freedom of speech of ex-LGBT persons, that the LGBT persons who do not accept their homosexuality and desire to change could receive the support of both professional therapists and pastors, that the society had access to various sources of information, including the Protestant doctrine, in regard to sexual identity and the existence of different solutions offered to persons seeking help for unwanted same-sex feelings and behaviors, that the employees from all market sectors had the right not to perform activities that could contradict their beliefs. Currently, when ex-LGBT persons share testimonials of their transformation, their message is defined as hate speech. However, there are more and more people who experience the true transformation of their sexual identity. I am such an example. 4 years ago, I was a lesbian, and today, I am a woman who can't wait to be married to a man and have children. Even though my family and society was supportive of my choice as a lesbian, deep inside I was unhappy. Luckily, in one of the Protestant churches, I found support and love and transformed my sexuality. We are existing identities, and we should have the freedom to believe and say that sexuality is not fixed. Why do transgender people have the right to change their sex so that it matches the way they feel inside, and at the same time, LGBT people who want to remove the same-sex attraction from their life are denied this right? I was a lesbian myself, and I fully understand and love this community. And we don't want to push our on anyone. We simply want to say that it's not a speech
Thank
of
you
hate,
very much.
but
I now
love.
give the floor to Serbia, to be followed by B'nai B'rith International.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chair. Since there is very little time, I'll just be brief. And good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dušan Kozarev, Deputy Director in the Office for Kosovo and Metohija in the Government of Serbia. You'll find everything in detail when it comes to this report. I'll just be brief in thesis. That there were, since the last report, this time last year, more than 70 ethnically and religiously motivated attacks against the Serbs and Albanians in Kosovo and Metohija province. Situation worsened, people pushed to leave their homes and IDPs frightened against returning. So-called Kosovo police went over their competences and even beaten up diplomatic UN personnel at one instance. Churches are looted and desecrated, as well as private homes, property of Serbs being stolen on a regular basis as an intimidation effort. Even Christmas gifts for the Serbian children were seized by the Kosovo police. So-called taxes of 100% on the goods coming from Central Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina are aimed to isolate Serbs in Kosovo and Metohija. Therefore, in the spirit of what you mentioned at the beginning of this panel session, in spite of this all, the Republic of Serbia remains patient and prudent, committed to dialogue and peace and to compromise-oriented settlement of the centuries-old Kosovo knot, and to enhancing cooperation in the region. We propose taxes to be revoked immediately and call upon international community to help on that, attacks and intimidations to stop, dialogue to continue, and for all of us to seek compromise solution for the situation on the ground. And a special round of attention to be turned at the ISIS, so-called ISIS fighters returning to Kosovo. Some of 400 went to the Middle East throughout the course of the last couple of years, and around 250 returned. But as I said, and not to take any more of your time, you can find more in the circulated report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to B'nai B'rith International, to be followed by Tajikistan.
Madam Moderator, of all the hatreds that tear at our social fabric today, none is more resilient or adaptable than anti-Semitism. In my home country of the United States, the problem has become strikingly apparent as synagogue mass shootings in Pittsburgh and San Diego in the past year have left American Jewry shaken and fearful for its safety. The responsibility of us all to confront this phenomenon is becoming increasingly urgent. To do this, we need practical tools such as ODIHR's Words into Action project, which, with the support of the German government, has countered anti-Semitism through activities in the areas of education, security, and coalition building. It is crucial that this work continue in some context, as the need is more pressing than ever. B'nai B'rith calls on the OSCE to continue its support of ODIHR's Tolerance and Non-Discrimination Unit and its programs to combat the unique and uniquely persistent social illness of anti-Semitism. Now is simply not the time to reverse course. As a result of anti-Semitic attacks, thousands of Jews have emigrated from Western Europe to Israel in each of the past several years. Furthermore, participation in Jewish institutions has declined. At the same time, security has of necessity been increased. The Jewish Holy New Year of Rosh Hashanah begins Sunday night. Synagogue attendance is expected to suffer as a result of fear about openly practicing Judaism. The rise of anti-Jewish hatred has also resulted in proliferation of anti-Semitic propaganda, much of which is directed against the state of Israel in the form of demonization and delegitimization of the Jewish state. Much has been done to fight anti-Semitism in the past decade or more, but much work remains. To this end, the Ministerial Council should approve a working definition of anti-Semitism based on the IRA model. We must continue to affirm commitments made at the 2004 Berlin Conference on Anti-Semitism. We must fulfill requirements and data requirement. And finally, we must reinforce the principle of Berlin Conference. No political position, cause, or grievance can ever justify anti-Semitism, and make clear that the demonization of the Jewish state is often other than a pretext for the hatred
to be
of Jews
followed
themselves.
by Kyrgyzstan.
Dear participants, the Republic of Tajikistan supports all international and regional initiatives and condemns all forms of discrimination and intolerance based on different measures. Turning to recommendation and wishes, we know that the Tajik side deeply regrets that OICE provides a platform for organizations which ideologies are based on the principles of religious intolerance, propaganda of religious violence, as well as anti-Semitism and xenophobic content. An example of such organization is IRPT Bennett in Tajikistan, the activists of which back in 19th and the last century used the Iranian revolutionary slogans "Death to Israel," "Death to Jews," "Death to America," and others, although these countries had no relation with the situation in Tajikistan during that period. Photos and videos confirming this can be easily found online. The IRPT had been officially publishing literature promoting religious intolerance and hatred towards people of other religion, in particular Jews and Christians. So in the book, Why Did You Turn Back to Islam, published by the Committee of Culture of the Islamic Renaissance Party, violence and hatred toward Jews and Christians is propagated. The page 31 of book is titled The Jews Hated Nation, and the most famous fabricated anti-Semitic text, The Protocol of Elders of Zion, introduced readers to the theory of Jewish conspiracy and calling to end the so-called Jewish domination in the world and denying Holocaust. Today, many of Tajik Islamists have taken refugees in EU countries registered under other names. However, they continue to preach similar ideas which can be seen on their pages on social networks. Based on foregoing, we urge OICE as well as other interest parties to pay attention on these facts and limit the presence of participants of organizations whose ideology is based on the principle of religious intolerance, propaganda of violence, anti-Semitism, and Judophobia in OICE events, including inviting and giving them opportunities to speak can be compared to giving a speech to Eichmann or Mengele and presenting them as vulnerable victims. Thank you. Will be delivered.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Kyrgyzstan, to be followed by Constantinopolitan Society.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. The fight against racism, xenophobia, intolerance and discrimination remains on the agenda of the international community. In order to root out these phenomena, we need to harness the efforts not only of the government but also civil society. In Kyrgyzstan, all forms of discrimination, xenophobia and racism are prohibited in all spheres of public life. This is enshrined in government policy and underpinned by the principles of equality and non-discrimination. We've implemented measures to foster cultural diversity and to meet the ethnic and cultural needs of people of different from different groups. We have taken upon ourselves various international obligations in line with international law. Our constitution of 2010 lays the groundwork for the development of legislation outlawing discrimination. I am the head of the state agency on local self-government and inter-ethnic relations, which is part of the government. In Kyrgyzstan, we have 30 roughly cities and roughly 40 regions. Many of them are polyethnic cities and regions. There we have nurseries where people can come and talk about interethnic relations. We also have a monitoring center which responds to instances of conflict and extremism. As things stand in the Kyrgyz Republic, we're working vigorously to implement the recommendations of the UN Committee on Racial Discrimination. By way of conclusion, I want to thank the OSCE for giving me the opportunity to speak on behalf of the Kyrgyz delegation. I wish you a most fruitful meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to the Constantinopolitan Society, to be followed by the Association of Tajiks in Kazakhstan.
Dear moderator, delegates and civil society's representatives, thanking the Slovakian chairmanship on behalf of Constantinopolitan Society, a non-governmental, non-profit organization established in 1828 in Athens, capital of Greece, by forcibly expatriated members of the Greek minority of the former Constantinopolis, Istanbul of nowadays. I inform you that our intervention will briefly focus on religious intolerance issues that the ecumenical patriarchate in Turkey is still confronted with. The Turkish government has not so far alleviated serious restrictions on religious freedom, including state policies and suffocating regulations that deny legal personality, status of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, its right to own, maintain, and manage property, train the religious clergy, and offer religious education. As an example, the Greek Orthodox Theological School of Kalki, which had been operating since 1844, the only Greek Orthodox educational institution in Turkey for training its religious leadership, remains closed since 1971. Although the Turkish government and officials have taken expressing support for reopening the seminary, non-concrete steps have been taken so far. However, since thousands of Imam Hatip schools have been opened. As a concluding remark, we would like to underline that respect for religious freedoms is the responsibility of every state. Respect for these rights is beneficial for Turkey and will safeguard pluralism and diversity in this country. Thanking you for your attention. I'd like to inform you that the full statement with recommendations is available on the Human Dimension Implementation Meeting official website. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the Association of Tajiks in Kazakhstan, to be followed by the Order of St. Andrew.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Madam Moderator, substantial efforts are made by the OSCE to combat racism, xenophobia, and discrimination. Now, for Tajikistan, which experienced a terrible war in the 90s, the problem of racism, xenophobia, and discrimination is still a very topical issue. At the time of the war, terrorist organizations such as the Islamic Renaissance Party carried out xenophobic policies. By way of an example, I might mention that on 17 May 1994, members of the Islamic Renaissance Party killed the director of an American company in Tajikistan. On 18 September 1994, members of that party killed Colonel Wolfsponyer, an Austrian national. And then on another occasion, members of the party killed Viktor Kulin, a journalist working for Russian television. And terrorist members of the Islamic Renaissance Party also killed a French national Karian man who was working for an international organization. And then in 1998, the terrorist organization, the Islamic Renaissance Party, killed a Polish citizen who was working for the United Nations. And then subsequently a citizen of Uruguay, a citizen of Japan. There are many such cases on the books. So it should be noted that the objective of this terrorist organization, the Islamic Renaissance Party, was a violent overthrow of power in Tajikistan with a view to setting up an Islamic state. And no one can deny that because that really was their objective.
Union. Sir, your time is up. I now turn to the Order of St. Andrew. Thank you very much.
The Ecumenical Patriarchate continues to suffer discrimination by the Turkish government. I discussed 4 issues. There are others. Please refer to the documents we have submitted for publication. Number 1, confiscation of property. We ask for 2011 decree promising a return of confiscated property to be reopened and administered fairly. In 1936, the Ecumenical Patriarchate and institutions owned 8,000 parcels. Today that number is down to 500, mostly churches and other non-income producing property. Property has been lost through the years due to overt government decrees and confiscatory taxes in violation of Turkey's obligations under the Treaty of Lausanne. 2, legal standing. The Ecumenical Patriarchate should be afforded legal personality so that it can have access to the Turkish legal system, a right which other Turkish citizens and Turkish institutions enjoy. Number 3, fair elections of Minority Foundation Board members. The Turkish government should schedule fair elections for Minority Foundation Board members which are long overdue. The present foundation system for the management of property is not manageable. Clergy should be allowed to serve as board members as well as other citizens, even if they do not reside in a district in which property is located, so long as they are citizens of Istanbul. And 4, Halki Seminary, again, over and over again. We ask for the reopening of the Halki Seminary, as did the representative of the United States to this body 5 days ago in working session 6. The Turkish government forced the Halki Seminary to close in 1971, and it still has not allowed the school to reopen despite repeated requests to do so by world leaders and even by the Muslim president of the Religious Affairs Directorate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to France on behalf of the European Union, to be followed by Canada.
Madam Moderator, it's my honor to make this declaration on behalf of the European Union. North Macedonia, Montenegro, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia, Liechtenstein, Moldova, Armenia, Georgia, Andorra also associate themselves with this statement. Combating all forms of discrimination and promoting tolerance is essential for the promotion and the universal protection of fundamental rights and freedoms such as freedom of expression, freedom of religion or conviction, or the liberty of assembly. And these are all priorities for the European Union. This fight is indispensable to ensure full respect for the inalienable principle according to which all human beings are born and remain throughout their lives free and equal in dignity and in right, a principle that was enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. Its full implementation goes hand in hand with fundamental rights and freedoms, and it's an essential factor for security and cooperation in Europe. We are concerned by the selective and fragmented approach promoted by some participating states or some non-governmental organizations in the combating of intolerance and discrimination. Any manifestation of intolerance and racism generates tension and instability, whatever the basis may be, and any discrimination must be equally condemned, whatever the basis may be. Therefore, we must unflaggingly combat in a universal way all forms of discrimination, all hate discourse, all incitement to violence. The reality of acts of intolerance and discrimination is often complex, and we must remain vigilant in the combating of the multiple forms of discrimination. In 2007 in Madrid, the participating states admitted the specificity of various forms of intolerance, while recognizing at the second time the importance of adopting a global approach and of taking into consideration cross-cutting issues in order effectively to combat all forms of discrimination. It is precisely this approach, inscribed in our common commitments of the OSCE, that the European Union continues to promote instead of ceding to the temptation of segmentation of their common commitments. Participating states should unite their efforts in order better to combat various forms of discrimination and collectively to act on the political, economic, and social root causes of this increase in violence and intolerance. And the full text will be on the website of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Canada, to be followed by the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Moderator. Canada offers the following 4 recommendations. First, that the chairperson in office table a draft ministerial council decision on the adoption of the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism. Second, that OSCE participating states consciously and proactively foster inclusive approaches and go beyond reactively responding to hate and discrimination. Third, for ODIHR to continue their steady work to uproot racism, discrimination, and exclusion of all kinds, and to advance inclusion and respect for diversity. And fourth, that all participating states eliminate laws and policies that discriminate against persons based on their sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, or sex characteristics, and to prevent acts of violence targeting LGBTI persons. Our government is deeply concerned about the rise of xenophobia, hatred, and discrimination witnessed around the world. Consistent and targeted violent attacks demonstrate that no country or community is immune. In June of this year, Canada's Anti-Racism Strategy 2019 to 2022 was introduced, which will invest 45 million Canadian dollars to fight systemic discrimination through community programs, public education campaigns, and combating online hate. As a multicultural, multi-faith, and multi-ethnic society with linguistic duality and a long history of immigration and integration, Canada is committed to championing pluralism, respect for diversity, and inclusion internationally and at home. At home, Canada recognizes the historical roots of racism and its different impacts on Indigenous peoples, as well as racialized and religious minority communities. As noted in the previous session, Canada is working with its Indigenous people closely. We believe that the misconceptions surrounding the fight against anti-Muslim discrimination needs to be challenged. Our anti-racism strategy also includes a working definition of Islamophobia, as we believe that words matter when it comes to promoting inclusion and eliminating discrimination. Anti-Semitism persists as one of the greatest sources of discrimination and intolerance in the OSCE region, including in Canada, but we are committed to fighting it. We welcome the report of Rabbi Baker following his visit to Canada in October 2018, and we are taking steps to include his recommendations, including the adoption of the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. Another crucial component is our anti-Black racism strategy, as well as our strong support for the rights of LGBTI persons. Our unabridged statement will be distributed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I turn now to the Russian Federation, to be followed by the Institute of Legal Policy and Social Protection, named in the honor of Irina Brzezinska.
Madam Moderator, ladies and gentlemen, let me get the ball rolling with some recommendations. First of all, we call for participating states to implement the instructions given at the Ministerial Council in Basel in 2014 on elaborating declarations on the fight against intolerance and discrimination against Christians and Muslims. This should be a priority for the OSCE's humanitarian agenda. We call on the country holding the chairmanship to do everything within its power to ensure that this is implemented. Second, we call on all countries to approve the annual UN resolution, glorification of Nazism and disability of certain practices that contribute to fueling contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. We want to note that the OSCE region is facing the serious threats of racism and xenophobia. We've seen anti-Semitism on the rise. 89% of people polled in Austria, Belgium, Hungary, Germany, Denmark, Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, Poland, UK, France, and Sweden believe that anti-Semitism has increased over the last 5 years. We're also most worried about the rise of anti-Semitism in Ukraine. The Israeli Ministry of Diaspora Affairs issued a report covering 2018. In that report, Ukraine tops the list of post-Soviet states in terms of the number of reported anti-Semitic incidents in political discourse. There's also been many cases of vandalism of Jewish cemeteries and memorials to Holocaust victims. Furthermore, anti-Semitism goes hand in hand with other manifestations of intolerance and hate, phobia of Islam and Christianity. Christians are often being subjected to attacks, they're being persecuted against, beaten, and sometimes killed. We're also worried about the rise of militant atheism in France, where Christianity is being squeezed out of public life, and Christians are often the victims of crime motivated by hate against Christians. Very often we see official figures condoning these kinds of incidents. We want to remind everyone that equating given faiths with terrorism and extremism are unacceptable. We take as our starting point that the OSCE must exploit its considerable potential to vigorously protect Muslims, Jews, Christians, and believers of other faiths. Thank you very much. The full version of my text will be submitted to the Secretariat.
Thank you very much. I move now to the Institute of Legal Policy and Social Protection, named in the honor of Irina Brzezinska, to be followed by NGO Anti-Fascist Human Rights League.
I'm the director of the Ukrainian Institute of Legal Policy and Social Protection, named in the honor of Irina Brzezinska. The Ukrainian government, since 2014, has been flagrantly violating the standards of the Ukrainian constitution when it comes to a separation of church and state and ensuring a full independence of church states. Millions of believers are discriminated against, and I'll move immediately to the recommendations. I propose that the Ukrainian government be obligated to change the amendments introduced in the law on religious belief, in accordance with which the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church is obligated to change its name, which is an unacceptable interference by the state in religious issues. In April of 2018, President Poroshenko, who had been re-elected then, and then subsequently the Verkhovna Rada, got in touch with the Patriarchate and called for the setting up of a new Ukrainian Orthodox Church on a non-canonical basis in a way that is not recognized by other churches, and in particular the Kiev Patriarchate of the Orthodox Church. And now this attempt to bring together various churches and cathedrals is under a new banner is an attempt to create a new church. I mean, it's an absurdity for a state to create a new religion. But in April of 2018, the forces of the Secret Service called on the Ukrainian priests to come to discussions in the course of which they were encouraged to join the new church. And there was an assembly organized by the President of Ukraine together with members of that religion. Has my time come to an end? I would call on these recommendations to be accepted because the monitoring mission on human rights has concentrated attention on this, and it really is a dire issue.
Human Rights League, to be followed by Ukraine.
We want to draw the attention of all participants to the fact that Oh Dear, in keeping with its remit, observes elections so as to verify whether fundamental freedoms and the principle of pluralism are being respected. However, millions of Ukrainian citizens were discriminated against as the Ukrainian authorities did not give them the right to elect Verkhovna Rada members and the president. In 2018, the Central Electoral Commission of the Ukraine flouted the rules and shut down all polling stations in the Russian Federation, where millions of Ukrainians were staying because of the dire economic straits Ukraine found itself in. As a result of that economic situation, those Ukrainians had moved to Russia. Following the elections, Oh Dear congratulated the Ukrainian authorities, saying the elections were well run. However, general norms and European legal norms were not upheld. Also, starting in 2014, we've been observing the rise and resurgence of neo-Nazism, including in the circles of power. For instance, many paramilitary groups operating in Ukraine have been recognized as being terrorist groups. Nonetheless, these groups continue to operate and have close ties to various branches of the government. They are also being granted budgetary resources, enjoying the status of a civil society association. Very often they work hand in hand with the National Security Services. Another terrible neo-Nazi organization is the Azov Battalion. It used to be a paramilitary group, but now it is a neo-Nazi political group, which is now actually part of the National Guard of Ukraine.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Ukraine, to be followed by the Center for Human Rights, Aja Ik.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. My name is Anton Koronevich. I am a permanent representative of the President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. I would like to draw your attention to considerable deterioration of the situation of fundamental human rights due to the existing regime of occupation in the territory of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, Ukraine, which are now currently temporarily occupied by the Russian Federation, and this lead to harassment and discrimination against the citizens of Ukraine residing in the temporarily occupied territory on religious grounds. According to the activists, human rights groups, and mass media, the Russian authorities continue to discriminate the religious communities of Jehovah's Witnesses, the worshippers of the Crimean Diocese of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church or Orthodox Church of Ukraine, and the Crimean Tatar Muslims. Regarding the recommendations, we recommend the OSCE ODIHR to monitor the situation with the freedom of consciousness and religion, including the activity of the religious organizations in the occupied Crimea. We also recommend the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission in Ukraine to monitor the security and humanitarian situation in the temporarily occupied territory of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. In 2019, the occupying authorities continue to detain and imprison the Crimean Tatars, Muslims, and in accordance with the NGO's information, there were more than 200 arrests carried out by the Russian law enforcement agencies. Only this year, 10 Crimean Tatars received the maximum sentences from 7 to 17 years of imprisonment. Ukrainian Orthodox Church Kyiv Patriarchate, or now called Orthodox Church of Ukraine, is one of the religious communities of Crimea which is facing extremely difficult situations. Now they have only several premises left, with the main cathedral in Simferopol, which they cannot use now. And on 6 September 2019, the UN Human Rights Committee demanded the Russian authorities not to prevent the use of the cathedral building in Simferopol by the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And unfortunately, the religious community Jehovah's Witnesses also are recognized as extremists in Russian Federation and are subjected to persecution. Thank you. The whole text will be transmitted to the Secretariat.
Thank you very much. I now turn to the Center for Human Rights Studies, AJAIC, to be followed by the United States of America.
Добрый день.
Good afternoon. Intolerance and discrimination is a problem of global proportions, afflicting contemporary society and scuppering humanity's development. Tolerance, including tolerance towards other faiths in Kazakhstan, is a common currency. However, we have seen some isolated incidents. For instance, in 2018, a Jehovah's Witness preacher insulted some religious currents of Islam, resulting in a conflict with a local imam. On the 6th of September, a Russian Orthodox church had profanities written across it. The law enforcement authorities detained the perpetrator, and he said that he wrote these horrible things on the church because of his devotion to Allah. It's clear that whether we have such incidents depends on what the believers actually think and do. Having said that, it's very important that the government shows no favoritism to any specific faith, because that might open the door to discrimination against other currents, other faiths. For instance, the preambular part of the law on the religious associations and religious activities, which talks about the role of Hanafi Islam and Orthodox Christianity in the development of the culture and the spiritual life of our country. This is one example. Some confessions, some faiths are accorded privileges and support for the building of their places of worship. However, some minorities are, in fact, facing persecution. What we see is that some religious minorities are upset because they're barred from taking part in summits bringing together world and traditional religions. I recommend that the government of Kazakhstan should step up efforts to inculcate the values of tolerance, including as part of the initial religious literacy classes offered in educational establishments.
The next speaker on the list, the United States of America, to be followed by the Legal Information Center for Human Rights.
I'm Ilan Carr, United States Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. The United States is committed to combating intolerance in all of its forms. All persons are born equal in rights and dignity, regardless of race, color, national origin, religion, gender, disability, sexual orientation, or identity. But let me focus on the most ancient and relentless form of hatred, anti-Semitism. Only 75 years since the Nazi crematoria have cooled, anti-Semitism continues its global rise. Jews in Central and Eastern Europe tell me of their distress over the growth of far-right ethnic supremacist movements, while Jews in Western Europe tell me they live in fear of militant Islamists. And Jews in the United Kingdom confided that some are considering emigrating because of anti-Semitism from the far left. I've found fear among Jewish communities in my own country as well. I spoke at the funeral of Lori Kay, who was murdered in the Chabad of Poway synagogue. That shooting happened 6 months to the day after Jewish worshippers were murdered in the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh. And I've met with student leaders on campuses across my country who report that Jewish ethnicity, Jewish history, and the right of the State of Israel to exist are attacked and denied by those who traffic in the anti-Semitism of the far left. Anti-Semitism is evil. It does not matter if it comes from ethnic supremacists on the right, anti-Zionists on the left, or from militant Islamists. We need to combat all of it. To take effective action, We must be able to identify anti-Semitism in all of its manifestations. The IRA definition is a game changer. In his 2019 State of the Union address, President Trump declared, quote, "We must never ignore the vile poison of anti-Semitism or those who spread its venomous creed," end quote. We must all understand what is at stake here. Anti-Semitism is history's greatest barometer of human suffering. The horrors of the last century have made the OSCE region especially aware of the widespread wreckage that results from anti-Semitic hatred. We will work with OSCE states, ODIHR, the three tolerance representatives, the private sector, and civil society to combat the scourge. The fight against anti-Semitism and against all hate is about all of us and our future. What kind of countries do we want our children to inherit? It's for them that we fight this fight, and it is for them that we must win it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to the Legal Information Center for Human Rights, to be followed by the Latvian Human Rights Committee.
Thank you. Thank you very much, moderator. Dear participants, since time is very limited, I will start with the recommendations because the full text of the statement has been made available to the Secretariat and it will be therefore available to all participants in this conference. But just before I read out the recommendations, let me note with pleasure that on 20 September in the Estonian Parliament, thanks to the governing party, a draft law of the Reform Party was rejected. That draft law would have forced all schools to teach only in Estonian. The draft law would have completely excluded the possibility of teaching in Russian in the education system, but the negative trend to discriminate in education remains in place, and that is why we have the following recommendations. The authorities of Estonia, in accordance with Articles 26 and 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, guarantee the right to individuals to use their mother tongue and to have access to their own culture, not only for Russian-speaking groups, but others as well. In this regard, the notorious division of 40-60%, with only 40% in Russian and 60% of classes in Estonian in Russian schools should be rejected. That is discriminatory, and that is essential for the cultural and linguistic rights of minorities to be guaranteed. And I might note that the middle school education in the Russian language in Estonia has been uninterruptedly available since the 19th century. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to the Latvian Human Rights Committee, to be followed by the Muslim community in Bulgaria.
Thank you. Our recommendations for Latvia are, first, to appoint people committed to multiculturalism to the offices charged with executing integration policy. Second, to refrain from persecuting anti-racism activists. And third, to condemn and persecute hate speech and hate crime regardless of where they come from or towards which group they are directed. To give the context for these recommendations, first, the Latvian authorities do from time to time persecute hate speech, but in low-level cases. When the cases are high-level, suddenly the authorities are silent. A recent example is a call of a famous radio personality to get rid of ethnic Russians, as it was done with Baltic Germans before. Interestingly, the current Minister of Defense has criticized her stance about Germans, but was silent about Russophobia. Another case is that recently the new government was formed, and now the new Prime Minister's advisor on integration policy is a former politician who was most famous by calling Russian language, a language, by the way, of more than a third of the population, to be a language of a foreign country only. Finally, when one stands against xenophobia, one risks persecution. This is the case of one of my colleagues in the Latvian Human Rights Committee, who criticized both Russophobia and anti-Semitism, coming herself from a mixed Jewish-Russian family, and now has a criminal case against her. Finally, the State Security Service criticizes those criticizing annual marches of honoring Waffen-SS. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the Muslim community in Bulgaria, to be followed by the European Yozgat Federation.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Bias incidents, intolerance and discrimination continue to be a serious threat to the Muslim community in Bulgaria. However, the extent and manifestations of this reality are often unknown and undocumented, especially in official data sources, meaning that it can be difficult to analyze the situation and to establish solutions to it. Recent years, a number of Islamophobic and bias-motivated incidents against Muslims were recorded. Almost all cases remain undisclosed and unpunished, with the exception of a few. One of the main reasons is that hate crimes are typically investigated as offenses motivated by hooliganism, or it turns out that the perpetrators are usually mentally ill. Another issue of serious concern is restitution of communal properties of the Muslim community in Bulgaria, which is one of the most important issues, remain unsolved after the democratic changes. On a positive note, I should point out that notwithstanding the many serious human rights violations on ethnic and religious grounds, many positive changes have taken place in recent years. Despite the extremely xenophobic sentiments and discriminatory intentions of some political parties in the course of the debate on a new law on religions in the country, the National Assembly of Bulgaria succeeded in passing a good law, which is a great achievement in building trust between religious communities and the state. This deserves admiration for the Bulgarian government and the National Assembly. In my written statement, I have proposed a strategy and recommendations to combat intolerance and discrimination. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now turn to the European Yozgat Federation, to be followed by CJL, Committee Justice and Liberty Portu.
Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, herzlichen Dank.
Ladies and gentlemen, many thanks for giving me the opportunity to take the floor. Of late, in the EU, we've heard many anti-Muslim statements in Austria, in Germany, and in France. On a daily basis, we hear about mosques being attacked. What happened in the United States of America, in New Zealand, we all heard about those incidents. I am speaking, of course, about the attacks on mosques, about killings of innocent people. The reason is that on social media and on other platforms, xenophobic views are being disseminated, not just on social networks, also on TV and traditional media outlets. There's a lot of talk about xenophobia, about hate speech targeting Muslims. We need to do something in order to resolve the situation. Xenophobic politicians have been rising to prominence. For instance, in Austria, a Freedom Party politician stated that Islam cannot be part of Austrian culture. And in fact, his party has been inciting hatred vis-à-vis Muslims. We need to root out this phenomenon. Unless the EU does something, unless it responds, our various cultures will not be able to coexist, which is something no one wants. We don't want to go back to the 1940s. We're in favor of the freedom of cultures. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now turn to CJL, Committee Justice and Liberty Portu, to be followed by Western Thrace Minority University Graduates Association.
Thank you very much. It'll be in French. Nous voici une nouvelle fois à dénoncer.
Here we are, once again, talking about the discrimination which many people are being subjected to in the OSCE region. Unfortunately, there's so much bad will in the room that we can talk about abdication or, at worst, complicity. In France, there's been discrimination against Roma, black people, and Muslims. Over the last 15 years, there have been many studies pointing out the structural racism which we see in discrimination in schools, at work, in healthcare, access to law enforcement services. Thus, the Muslim community must be subjected to the violence on the part of the state in the name of the fight against terrorism. So what we call the Muslim is now being castigated, and this is considered perfectly normal. Thus, what we see is that white supremacy is being excused throughout the political spectrum. What's the result? Terrorism, like we saw in Christchurch. We need to confront the threat of white supremacy, some say, and this is shameful. The Minister of National Education has said that Muslims should not have the right to wear headscarves. When all these kinds of statements are being made, we see that some are abusing their office in order to portray Muslims as the fifth column. They're inciting people to commit violent acts against them. Therefore, we call for neutrality so that all civil servants, law enforcement agencies do not act in line with their ideologies, but in keeping with the law. That way we can stamp out discrimination, hate, we can prevent racist propaganda being disseminated. Thank you very much.
You were well within time. Thank you very much. I now turn to the Western Thrace Minority University Graduates Association, to be followed by the Mejlis of Crimean Tatar People.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. My name is Pervin Hayrullah. I am representing the Turkish minority in Greece. The Turkish minority in Western Thrace, Greece, whose number is around 150,000, cannot enjoy fully its religious rights. The election of muftis constitutes the main problem regarding the religious liberties of the Turkish minority of Western Thrace. The right to elect their own religious leaders is granted to the Turkish minority in accordance with international and national legal arrangements. However, in 1985, upon demise of Mufti Hüseyin Mustafa Efendi by appointing the Mufti of Komotini without any consultation whatsoever with the Turkish minority, the Greek authorities ignored the long-established and practiced right of minority to elect its own religious leaders. The arbitrary investigations against representatives of the Turkish minority have revealed that there is political intimidation and pressure against the Turkish minority. The religious leaders and NGOs representatives of the Turkish minority are summoned to the police station to testify with many charges, and they are not being informed truly of all charges. The elected muftis of the minority have been called to bear testimony on numerous different occasions. In recent years, there is a noticeable increase on the hate-motivated attacks, crimes, and hate speech towards the representatives of the Turkish minority. These attacks can be considered as a systematic tool of discrimination against persons belonging to the Turkish minority. An arson attack on a minority journalist car is one of the recent examples of such hate incidents in Western Thrace. The Turkish minority of Western Thrace calls upon the Greek state to protect and promote the Turkish minority's religious liberties and rights enshrined by the international and bilateral treaties, to respect and recognize the Turkish minority's elected muftis, and to take urgent measures and legal arrangements regarding the administration of pious foundations in line with the bilateral treaties. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now turn to the Mejlis of Crimean Tatar People, to be followed by the Office of the Ukraine Parliament Commissioner for Human Rights.
Madam Moderator, ladies and gentlemen, in the course of this meeting, many speakers have put out recommendations which, in the opinion of speakers, could improve the situation of minorities and indigenous peoples. Now, I would also like to make a recommendation, but I'm not very optimistic that the recommendations really are going to be turned into reality. I'm coming back to the situation in Crimea. As many of you know, there have been some conflicting statements concerning the situation in Crimea. and especially the indigenous people of the peninsula, namely the Crimean Tatars, and also ethnic Ukrainians. The overall objective of the Russian occupier is to expel from the peninsula any Crimean people who are not loyal to the occupying power. This is done through arbitrary detention and even through the assassination of certain individuals. But the Russian Federation is making huge efforts to try to convince the world that the human rights situation in Crimea is perfect, that it's ideal, especially insofar as Crimean Tatars are concerned. But that is cynicism and lies. Those statements are simply hypocritical. In fact, the situation is the following. We have a special monitoring mission of the OSCE. It has a mandate to visit any part of the Ukrainian state, including the city of Sevastopol and the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. And we believe that it is absolutely essential that this mandate be fulfilled. And then we will know through the eyes of the monitoring group what the situation in Crimea is, rather than through fake news being vehiculated by people in the pay of Moscow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to the office of the Ukrainian Parliament Commissioner for Human Rights, to be followed by Germany.
Ladies and gentlemen, the violation of international law. The Russian Federation is continuing in its legislation to engage in illegal acts on the peninsula of Crimea. The list of extremist organizations includes the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatar people, and its members are being prosecuted. In March of this year, a large-scale operation was carried out against the members of that organization because it is considered to be a terrorist group. 26 searches were carried out, 24 Muslims were detained, and they were supposedly guilty of setting up a terrorist organization. And Crimean Solidarity, an NGO group, saw its members being arrested simply because they were members of that group. 59 people were arrested and sentenced. There is no freedom of expression. There are many cases of discrimination, of kidnapping, of arbitrary detention, and when people express their own opinions, they are persecuted. In September of this year, a 20-year-old Crimean Tatar's body was found. He had disappeared a year ago. And in the occupied republic in the east of Ukraine, there are religious organizations that are, in fact, engaged in sowing terror. And a number of organizations have had to cease their activity or to go underground. There are Christian confessional groups are labeled to be extremist. And I think that only a full liberation of the occupied territories will make it possible for the citizens of Ukraine to be able freely to practice their religions once again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Germany, to be followed by Norway.
Frau Vorsitzende, vielen Dank. Ich möchte zunächst
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. First and foremost, I should like to note that we want to respond specifically to the statement made by the Scientologists, their representatives. In June of 2017, we adopted an action plan for combating racism. The key objectives of that document include ensuring respect for human rights, protection against discrimination, an end to political crime, civic education, and the development of social society, fostering intercultural dialogue, building skills in this area, and the fight against intolerance online. Also, turning to what one of the colleagues mentioned regarding anti-Semitism. Germany's experience has led us to conclude that we have a special responsibility to uphold the values of democracy and tolerance. Our democracy is resilient because it is diverse, because we live in a diverse society. The fact that we can defend the values enshrined in our Constitution, working hand in hand, is part and parcel of the fight against anti-Semitism. Over the last few years, we've been implementing a project called From Words to Action. We're grateful to the ODIHR and to other participating states. We hope that we can continue working to strengthen Jewish communities, run educational programs aimed at anti-Semitism, combating anti-Semitism, and to implement other measures. We are working with our security forces in this area as well, and we're going to continue doing so. Moreover, we would like the International Agency for the Memory of the Holocaust to work on a definition of anti-Semitism. The number of anti-Semitic incidents in Germany is on the rise, despite all of the work we're doing. Nonetheless, despite that these might be crimes committed by people of a right-wing persuasion or a left-wing persuasion, we're going to combat them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Norway, to be followed by Armenia.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Regrettably, we continue to witness in our region incidents of hate speech, harassment of, and attacks on various religious and other minorities. We must learn from history and neither allow these forces of prejudice, intolerance, and discrimination to define our societies, nor to limit the freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief of our citizens. We need to redouble our efforts to further and respect the commitments we as states have undertaken to protect the human rights of our citizens. More specifically, I will put forward the following recommendations. First, for participating states to increase their efforts to support greater awareness of the dangers of hate speech and expressions of xenophobia, racism, and intolerance, be it in the form of hatred based on gender, ethnicity, religion or belief, disability, or sexual orientation. Awareness campaigns, the creation of dialogue fora, as well as training of teachers and educational material are some of the practical tools. Second, for states closely to monitor intolerance, discrimination, and prejudice based on religion or belief, including anti-Semitic, anti-Islamic, and all other discriminatory attitudes, and when publicly expressed, to address them firmly in accordance with OSCE and other human rights commitments. And thirdly, to draw on ODIHR's expertise in implementing measures to counter these negative forces, including through training of law enforcement, prosecution, and the judiciary in rights-compliant responses to hate crime. In Norway, the action plan against anti-Semitism adopted in 2016 has a particular emphasis on prevention and education. Surveys show a decrease of anti-Semitic prejudices in Norway over the last years. This is encouraging. The government has recently decided to also prepare an action plan against discrimination against Muslims. We look forward to continue to work with the executive structures of OSCE, with participating states and other stakeholders to prevent expressions of intolerance, discrimination, and prejudice from threatening the human rights of our citizens or the peace and security of our region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Armenia, to be followed by an NGO sociologist.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. The intolerance and xenophobia violate human dignity, create an image of an enemy within the society. Hate crimes on ethnic and religious grounds, specifically when promoted at state level, constitute serious security threat. From the bitter experience of our history, we know that this can result in hate-driven crimes and even crimes against humanity. We are facing an alarming situation in our region, when racist and xenophobic public discourse and open encouragement of hate crimes is a state policy of the political leadership of Azerbaijan. I would like to refer to the alarming trend of misuse of education system by Azerbaijan to marginalize certain ethnic and religious groups. Target group of such policy are children and youth, which are deprived from alternative views, thus becoming vulnerable to radicalization. Misinterpreting our own history and rewriting the history of others, eliminating references to cultural and spiritual heritage of other nations has become a common and extremely worrying practice. Unfortunately, the implications of such a policy can be long-term and eventually prevent the reconciliation process. Madam Moderator, the full version of our statement will be circulated. And I would like to recommend the auditor to assess the school educational materials against the content promoting exclusion and marginalization of specific ethnic and religious groups. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to NGO sociologist, to be followed by the Tajik Cultural Center for Samyan in Kazakhstan.
Спасибо.
Thank you. Rustam Haydarov, NGO sociologist. Distinguished participants, Bukhari Jews, for whom the Tajik language is their mother tongue, lived in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan for hundreds of years, in the Khanate of Kokand, in the Bukhara Emirate, and in the Khanate of Khiva. They traded, they also worked in medicine and in the sciences during the Soviet period. They made a contribution to the development of the Tajik arts, such as the Tajik opera, Tajik cinema, and in fact, many prominent people come to mind, those who contributed to the cultural flourishing of my peoples. In an interview given to Radio Liberty in 2018, my fellow countryman, Mr. Kamigarov, who now lives in Israel, said, "We're one people, the fruits of one tree. Our hearts beat in unison. Our mother tongue is also Tajik. We learned a lot from the Tajiks about friendship, about Eastern hospitality. We'll never forget the help that the Tajik people accorded to us. We lived together for 2,600 years, and our friendship will live eternal." However, religious fanatics did everything they could in order to force Bukhari Jews to leave Tajikistan.
Thank you very much. I now turn to the Tajik Cultural Center for Samyan in Kazakhstan, to be followed by the Information Group on Crimes Against the Person.
Madam Moderator, ladies and gentlemen, the ensuring the rights of national minorities is something that states can agree on. This is very important for stability in a state, and the international community agrees that this is crucial. After the decomposition of the Soviet Union, the Islamic Renaissance Party in the 90s started a war in Tajikistan, as a result of which there was a lot of hatred among the ethnic groups, and a lot of Russian ethnics left the Tajikistan. Before the war, there were representatives of some 30 ethnic groups. In accordance with the 1998 census in Tajikistan, there were more than 1 million Russians, 200,000 Jews, 32,000 Germans, 11,000 Kazakhs, 7,000 Belarusians, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, Bulgarians, in smaller numbers, but also some Poles even. Now, as a result of this terrible war, the representatives of the ethnic minorities, according to the census of 2010, you have the following figures: 24,000 Russians, 36,000 Jews, 11,000 Ukrainians, just a few Germans, just a few Belarusians, Armenians, 370 Azerbaijanis, 19 Bulgarians, and just 7 Poles. Now, as the results of the census shows, if you compare the figures between 98 and in this century, it was a terrible war. And the Islamic Renaissance Party in the 90s was calling on all individuals who were not Muslims to be killed. That include Russians, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Poles, and they had previously lived in peace with Tajikistan. I would call on the authorities of the United States, Germany, Canada, and other countries.
Thank you. We'll give the floor to Information Group on Crimes Against the Person, to be followed by Interregional Social Movement for Democracy and Human Rights.
Madam Moderator, dear colleagues, I'd like to draw your attention to what has been happening in Ukraine over the last few years, namely the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which has been subject to prosecution. On the basis of nationalist rhetoric and a nationalist policy, this largest faith, to which most of the population of Ukraine belongs, in just the last 3 years has been subject to a huge slander campaign in the mass media, several hundred seizures of churches, 13 attacks on churches, many cases of vandalism of churches, and even firing on churches by heavy artillery. The persecution and pressure by the state security apparatus with seizure of financial resources of the church, and on the well-known site of Mirotvorets, or Peace Builder, there is slander, and there have also been acts of aggression by other churches. And the state authorities have adopted a number of laws that undermine the rights of the believers in that church. So we call on the Ukrainian authorities to cease all pressure on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, as determined by the above-mentioned facts, to return all property previously belonging to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to that church, and to carry out a full investigation of all acts of violence and vandalism. And the human rights monitoring by the OSCE is absolutely necessary. That must be carried out in Ukraine, and pressure must be put on the Ukrainian authorities so that they really carry out the above-mentioned recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to the Interregional Social Movement for Democracy and Human Rights, to be followed by the Russian National Cultural Community.
Добрый день.
Good afternoon, Madam Moderator, dear participants. Together with the Historic Memory Organization, we had a roundtable this morning to celebrate the signing of a declaration to correct the errors of the past. We really must combat intolerance and xenophobia. And this declaration is really associated with our recommendation. The countries of Eastern Europe must take into consideration all problems connected with the implementation or enforcement of the Jesus Declaration. Third, the international organizations, the UN and the OSCE, should draw attention to this declaration as a very useful instrument for combating intolerance and xenophobia. Now, the principle of compensation for victims of the Holocaust, is that something that is really being enforced by countries? Many countries in Western Europe, yes, but there is a country that is blocking any restitution measures. This year, on the 10th anniversary of the Teresian Declaration, compensation or restitution for the Jewish community was rejected by Latvia, and that is not the first time, and we would call on international organizations, the UN, the European Union, and the OSCE to draw attention to this unacceptable situation and to put pressure on the Latvian authorities to change its legislation. The full text will be made available to the Secretariat. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to the Russian National Cultural Community, to be followed by the Council of Europe.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Over the last few years, we've been monitoring instances of discrimination and intolerance vis-a-vis national minorities in Ukraine, especially the Russian-speaking minority. This, of course, led us to register many instances of people complaining that their rights were being trampled because of their nationality. Some civil society representatives, some members of political parties have scored political points by discriminating against Russian speakers. The national law on national minorities stipulates that any direct or indirect violation of rights based on nationality is against the law. However, the law is not being applied in full. Article 2 of the Law on National Minorities and the Prevention of Discrimination states that Ukrainian legislation is grounded in the principle of non-discrimination, regardless of any factors such as nationality. All are equal before the law and all should be able to enjoy dignity. Very often, emotions get in the way. If something goes wrong, people look for scapegoats, especially right-wing politicians and politicians on the extreme right. The scapegoats are often ethnic Russians and the Russian state. Now, we have a couple of criteria which we use to pinpoint discrimination based on nationality. We believe that violations of the right to speak your native tongue, to get an education in your native tongue, stereotypes, all of these constitute violations. We call on the Ukrainian government to put an end to discrimination against Russian communities, to investigate the incidents that have taken place, and also to amend the Ukrainian law on languages to bring it into line with international norms so that it takes into account the rights of national minorities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to the Council of Europe, to be followed by the Human Rights Movement, Bir Dwino, Kyrgyzstan.
Madam Moderator, 2019 marks the 25th anniversary of the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, ECRI. To celebrate this landmark, ECRI is organizing a high-level conference under the French chairmanship of the Committee of Ministers in Paris on 26-27 September. The conference will take stock of 25 years of common efforts to promote equality and combat racism and intolerance. More importantly, it will play a key role in shaping the future action of both Council of Europe member states and ECRI in tackling present and emerging challenges in these fields. These range from increasing racism in Europe and the persistence of homophobia and transphobia to the threats and opportunities presented by artificial intelligence and the internet. The conference will bring together representatives of governments, international organizations, equality bodies and civil society from 47 member states of the Council of Europe, as well as experts and ECRI members. At the end of the conference, ECRI will announce and publish its roadmap for future work and main priorities, representing a commitment from ECRI to continue its course and a call to member states and stakeholders to take part in the journey. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Human Rights Movement, Bir Dwino, Kyrgyzstan, to be followed by AMISCO, European Muslim Initiative for Social Cohesion.
Conference participants, I must say that as things stand in Kyrgyzstan, we have over 80 nationalities representing different cultures and faiths. Of late, however, we've seen attacks and inhumane treatment vis-a-vis religious minorities, especially proselytizing Kyrgyzstanis. In 2018, a young Christian Kyrgyzstani man was beaten up by 3 Muslim men. Also, a Christian Kyrgyzstani woman was reburied on 3 occasions because the imams refused to have her buried in their cemeteries. We also had a case when places of worship, for instance churches, were attacked, as were Christian cemeteries. As an organization working to protect human rights and an organization that combats religious extremism, what we want to say that it's ordinary Muslim believers who are often put in danger as they're accused sometimes of religious extremism, and many of these people are Uzbek. Unfortunately, as things stand, religious intolerance intersects with inter-ethnic discord, that issue as well. So for Kyrgyzstan, it's very important that they adopt some kind of citizen identity plan. Thus, the relevant state agency, which addresses inter-ethnic relations, should play a leading role in this process. This body should have sufficient powers and enjoy technical support so as to address the issues in the inter-ethnic sphere as this impacts religious relations. Furthermore, the government must uphold the right to freedom of religion as enshrined in our constitution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Amisco, to be followed by Cage Advocacy UK Limited.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. First of all, Amisco would like to thank OSCE and ODHIR for choosing an important topic for 2019 Human Dimension Implementation meeting. And thanks to OSCE to make guidelines against hate speeches in this plenary session, and we are very happy to hear that and hear that there was no anti-Islam propaganda in these sessions today. So that is something beautiful which came out of that guidelines. Thirdly, for many years, Amisco has been working closely with ODHIR on the issue of hate crimes through providing inputs and to the hate crime reports and participating in the training sessions of ODHIR. ODHIR has provided fantastic training seminars for NGOs on hate crime against Muslims in a number of countries, including Bulgaria, Denmark, France, Germany, and Spain. ODHIR has also organized several regional roundtable meetings for governmental officials, experts, and civil society. And Amisco wishes to see those recommendations implemented by the member states. And also, we want to emphasize and strongly encourage the participating state to draw on ODHIR's expertise in combating hate crimes and developing educational programs to counter stereotypes of Muslim communities. Intolerance and discrimination against Muslims, which we call Islamophobia, have devastating effect not only on the daily lives of members of Muslim communities, but also on the society as a whole and relationship between countries. Last but not least, I would like to ask the American representative who so beautifully talked about Islamophobia, and I visited Ghetto in the morning and I was crying. Please, next year, focus a little bit also on Islamophobia, because in US and West, it is a very prevalent problem and Muslims are feeling under siege. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. I turn now to Cage Advocacy UK Limited, to be followed by European Humanist Federation.
Thank you, Moderator. My name is Mohammed Rabbani. I'm a representative of CAGE, which is an international advocacy organization based in the UK. It's well documented that Muslim minorities residing in the UK have been systematically targeted by sections of the media, political establishment, and far-right groups. Our research has shown that the rise of Islamophobia coincided with the UK's participation in the war on terror, a war that has seen the deaths of thousands of Muslims abroad and the creation of an arsenal of counter-terror laws to police Muslim minorities at home. Academics and lawyers have written extensively on the impact of these laws in enabling and normalizing suspicion against Muslims. It's this form of structural discrimination against Muslims that I want to draw your attention to today. Muslims' experience of Islamophobia takes place intensely under Schedule 7 border powers which operate across UK borders. Though it claims to protect national security, there is widespread and growing criticism of its draconian nature. Schedule 7 grants police the power to detain and interrogate without suspicion. You do not have the right to remain silent. DNA and fingerprints can be taken from you, and you can be detained for up to 6 hours. It's estimated over 1 million people have been impacted, 99.99% of whom are innocent. The law is discriminatory, Islamophobic, and it's an emergency power that should never have been normalized into law. It allows police officers to detain individuals based on their race and religion, so long as that's not the sole reason for the stop. Statistics show in one study that 88% of those stopped at a particular airport were Muslims. The UK Home Office has refused to release the data on religious profile. We call upon the UK government to release the data on religious profile, to cooperate fully with any investigation led by an all-parliamentary group on Islamophobia, and to initiate steps to repeal Schedule 7. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I turn now to the European Humanist Federation, to be followed by Azerbaijan. The European Humanist Federation?
Yes, the European Humanist Federation has reviewed with great interest the ODIHR publication Freedom of Religion or Belief and Security Policy Guidelines. in which the authors try to define a reasonable middle ground between ensuring the fundamental right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion to all individuals on one hand, and answering the security concerns related to acts of violence and terrorism committed by some groups of people motivated by their beliefs, on the other hand. We endorse the guiding principles from the chapter 3 of the aforementioned document, and we consider this document to be a step in the right direction. However, having said that, we would like to draw your attention to the fact that the only way to create conditions for a peaceful coexistence of several groups of people whose beliefs and whose needs resulting from their beliefs often contradict each other is through establishing a secular legislation system which doesn't favor any of those groups and ensures equal treatment and equal liberties to all of them. Liberties which are not infinite, but which are all equally limited to ensure respect to other citizens and other life stances. Therefore, we urge all the OC participating states to work towards achieving true secularism in their countries, as well as addressing the numerous issues of discrimination of non-believers and of minority religions. I can see here representatives of several states in which one state church or one majority religion is clearly privileged over others, where selected religious institutions interfere in the matters of state, where changing belief is not always possible, where criticizing some beliefs is a common thing and criticizing others is punishable by law. Let us also not forget that discrimination is a wide phenomenon and that followers of minority religions are able to discriminate too, especially the individuals who change their belief and wish to escape
May the
religious
speaker
community.
kindly conclude.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I turn now to Azerbaijan, to be followed by International Association of Islamic Business.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. One of the most important features of the religious policy of Republic of Azerbaijan is protection of rights to freedom of religion of all peoples living in the country. As a clear evidence of this policy, I would like to tell you about the activity of Azerbaijan to meet demand of UD people to restore autokephal nature of Albanian Apostolic Church. The UD people are autochthon ethnic group who compactly live in North Azerbaijan. They are one of the direct descendants of Albanian people who had their own state, Caucasian Albania. The Albanian Apostolic Church is the most ancient church in the Caucasus. In 1836, when Azerbaijan was a part of Tsarist Russia, Russian Tsar Nikolai I issued a decree which gave Albanian Christian Church under jurisdiction of Armenian Gregorian Church. The decree served as a base for further falsification of the history of Caucasian Albania, through including Caucasian Albania Apostolic Church into its jurisdiction. Armenian Gregorian Church wanted to put forward in future territorial pretension to Azerbaijan because Caucasian Albania was mostly located in the territory of present Azerbaijan. The further development of the history, particularly territorial pretension of Armenia to Nagorno-Karabakh region of Azerbaijan, revealed these intentions of Armenians. After getting the Caucasian Albanian Apostolic Church, Armenian began purposefully to forge architectural mode of construction of Albanian church, destroy archives of Albanian church with the aim to inherit material and cultural values of Azerbaijani history, presents them as Armenian ones. All Albanian churches in Nagorno-Karabakh region of Azerbaijan have been unfairly presented as Armenian ones. President of Azerbaijan tries to restore this truth and to give UD people autokephal nature of their church. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I turn now to International Association of Islamic Business, to be followed by Human Rights Development Center.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I have a very short note. I'm representing the International Association of Islamic Business with its headquarters in Moscow. We have offices in almost all regions of Russia, as well as in 20 countries of the world, Islamic and non-Islamic. Talking about harassment on Crimean Tatars in Crimea, I would like to mention that many members of Association I Crimean Tatars are working on the benefit of Umma and their families, but they are limited in their efficiency to work representing the association due to their inability to obtain visas on an equal basis with other Russians. This is the main regret we hear from them all the time. The association has also signed a memorandum of cooperation with the organization Crimea Birigli, which is fighting for the restoration of historical justice of Crimean Tatars. Speaking about the status of Muslims in Russia, I would like to note that the association, during the second year already, together with the largest commercial bank of Russia, Sberbank, holds the first and the second International Islamic Economic Forum aimed on developing the Islamic financial instruments in Russia and CIS countries. Also, it's important to say that Sberbank is actively developing Islamic bank windows. As a reminder, the number of Muslims in Russia is around 25 million. We have been living on this territory historically and are harmoniously integrated into the multicultural reality of the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I turn now to the Human Rights Development Center, to be followed by Azerbaijan Slavic Youth Organization.
Thank you, Ms. Moderator. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I represent Azerbaijan from Human Rights Development Center. Azerbaijan as a multi-ethnic country can be considered a role model in terms of tolerance and intercultural dialogue. There are a large number of small ethnic and religious minorities, including ethnic Armenians, living in the country in harmony with local nation. Mosques, churches, and synagogues are in harmony in capital of Azerbaijan. At the same time, the deputies, the representatives of these ethnic minorities are in parliament as a member of parliament and are able to represent in legislation body. Unfortunately, Azerbaijani nation are subject to discrimination as a result of Armenian deportation policy, which deprives their rights to live in historical lands. Today, they have no chance to return to their homes. At the beginning of the last century, after the Second World War and after the collapse of Soviet Union, thousands of Azerbaijanis have faced with ethnic cleansing and discrimination in their historical lands and have been deported from Armenia. In 1 century, 3 times ethnic Azerbaijanis have faced with ethnic cleansing and discrimination of their rights to live in their historical territory. These people who have lived in those territories for a century and as a result of deportation, they deprived to live in their historical motherland. I address from here to the Prime Minister of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, and to the OSCE head of states to restore this historical justice and to restore the status of Armenian Azerbaijanis. And by this way, to end to this discrimination, which is against the Armenian Azerbaijanis, and to provide their historical return to their lands. If Armenia really wants to prove to international community that it's not a mono-ethnic country, it should recognize the rights of these people. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I turn now to Azerbaijan Slavic Youth Organization, to be followed by Religious Society Path of Guru Jara.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. My name is Sabuhi Abbasov. I am a chairman of Azerbaijan Slavic Youth Association. Today's topic is very relevant because wars and conflict in the world today often start with intolerance and discrimination. Therefore, we should pay more attention in this issue. Any discrimination, whether religious or national, is inadmissible. Unfortunately, today in Europe, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are on the rise. Discrimination towards the Muslim refugees residing in Europe worries us. As a result of national and religious intolerance, my country has been at war for more than 30 years. We have lost 20% of our land and more than 1 million people have been displaced. Today, mosques in Nagorno-Karabakh and other occupied lands have been destroyed and historical monuments have been demolished. The responsibility for this lies with the Armenian state. Göçe district, the village where I was born, the tombs of my relatives, our historical monuments have been destroyed. Today, the official Yerevan, following a fascist policy, doesn't adhere to international law and human rights. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Religious Society Path of Guru Jara, to be followed by the Holy See.
On participations, recommendations to the Czech Republic in the case of religious leaders Guru Jara, Barbora Plaskova, the religious minority Path of Guru Jara, and for similar cases are basically the same as the last year, for the reason that these have been ignored so far. First, take immediately effective measures for the fulfillment of fair trial guarantee in the case, including the right to effective defense. This means also admissions of evidence on the part of defense. Second, the court should without delay decide about cancellation of the arrest warrant on Guru Yara and Barbara Plaskova, as its prolongation is against UE jurisprudence and it's causing arbitrary detention of these religious leaders for more than 4.5 years. Third, accused persons and religious communities should not be subjected to judicial harassment by unwarranted legal and administrative proceedings or any other form of misuse of administrative and judicial authority. 4, to adapt such registration system of religious community which will be friendly, flexible, supporting religious diversity within the country and without the influence of members of the Czech anti-cult movement. And 5th, protect the religious community, path of Guru Yara, and human rights defenders in their cause against hate speech, discriminations, and hate crimes in the Czech society with available support from the Czech state. The Czech state itself initiated the flat criminalization of the new religious movement Path of Guru Yara in 2010, so it's also up to the state to help eliminate the negative consequences and the damage caused by its intervention. After a year of inactivity, I raise the question again, how can the Czech Republic in this specific case finally and convincingly guarantee the implementation of European and international treaties which ensure the principle of fair trial, rule of law, and freedom of religion and belief? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the Holy See, to be followed by Sarah Tannen.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. No part of the OSCE region is immune from acts of intolerance and discrimination, including hate crimes against Christians and members of other religions. These include threats and violent attacks, resulting sometimes even in murder or in profanities of Christian churches and places of worship of other religions, cemeteries, and other religious properties. These phenomena, which give rise to a sense of insecurity, have a negative impact on the daily lives of Christians and members of other religions, and their enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms. They can also threaten the social cohesion inside participating states. Moreover, we should always bear in mind that Christians are targeted both in countries where they are a minority, as well in those where they represent the majority. Therefore, all attacks should be given equal attention, irrespective of where they are directed, and the majority or minority group, avoiding any partial and selective approach. Of great concern is the fact that across the OSCE region, a sharp dividing line seems to have been drawn between religious belief and religious practice. The false idea that religions have a negative impact and represent a threat to the well-being of our societies is growing. Christians are frequently reminded in public discourse or even in the courts that they can believe whatever they like in private and worship as they wish in their own churches, but they are prohibited from acting on those beliefs in public sphere. According to such growing opposition to the public role of religion, actions inspired by religious beliefs are unwelcome in some of our societies. The consequences of that is that individuals are prevailing from living and acting in accordance with the delicate dictates of their conscience and right that was recognized already by the Helsinki Final Act. Finally, the Holy See wishes to recall on all one of the glaring omissions of the participating states in fulfilling what they agreed to undertake, namely the still incomplete Basel task. This tasking, despite the efforts of some delegations to interpret established facts, remain an obligation on all of us. The Holy See remains confident that it will be possible to reach a consensus on a ministerial
Thank you very
declaration.
much. May I kindly ask the speaker to conclude?
Yes. And ministerial declaration enhancing efforts to combat intoleration and discriminations, including against Muslims, Christians, and members of other religions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. At this point, I would kindly remind any delegations who wish to exercise their right of reply to please approach behind me and add your name to the list. I do have, we'll take a point of moderator's privilege to make one announcement. I've been asked to announce that as we've been receiving some questions regarding ODIHR's reception, This is to inform you that the ODIHR reception will take place on Thursday, 26 December at 19:30 at the Maesa 3 building in Warsaw. The exact address can be found on the timetable, and there will be transport from the stadium to the reception venue at 19:20. I now give the floor to Sarah Tannen, to be followed by the Initiative Against the Racial and Religious Intolerance. I now give the floor to the Initiative Against Racial and Religious Intolerance, to be followed by the Yazidi Center for Human Rights.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. My name is Amina Karnic. I'm from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and today I'm representing the Youth Activist Initiative Against the Racial and Religious Intolerance. Dear guests, any of us in this room could have been amongst the victims of the terrific crime of the Christchurch in New Zealand this year, if we were Muslim. The manifestations of intolerance against Muslims have been more visible since the last HDM we had in 2018, and its global effects have not spared one of the only European Muslim majority countries, Bosnia and Herzegovina. That is why I strongly urge the representatives of my country to invest in the CSOs to help us combat the rising Islamophobic narratives in the country. We ask the OSCE participating states and OSCE ODIHR to work more on addressing Islamophobia in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Our society needs support in working harder on this issue and offer concrete resources and need-based tools. Bosnian authorities must not leave the hate crime incidents unsolved anymore. Moreover, we are aware of strong cooperation between the white supremacists, who are also pushed in action by hard Islamophobes. This happens on an international level, and even at the events such as this one. This is why we must address Islamophobia, respecting its global character. The global stance on Muslims reflects the case of my country, Bosnia and Herzegovina, which has experienced the most severe manifestation of Islamophobia, the genocide on 90s. The recent invocations of genocide perpetrators in the manifesto of the Christchurch attacker shows that toxic ideologies see no borders. A present narrative in Bosnian society aims to dehumanize and share hostility towards Muslims. It is coming from the leading far-right politicians as well as the ones from our neighboring countries. We do not wish to allow for the path for a new genocide or Holocaust to be set by the current leaders, and that is why we demand urgent action by implementing the above-mentioned recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I turn now to the Yazidi Center for Human Rights, to be followed by the National Association for Afro-Swedes. I turn now to the National Association for Afro-Swedes, to be followed by the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, University of Minnesota.
Oh, sorry. I would like to raise awareness on some issues that tend to be forgotten while discussing topics such as racism, discrimination, xenophobia, and other similar related issues. We need to acknowledge that mental illness exists even within the marginalized communities. By acknowledging that mental illness exists within our marginalized communities, we will have a better inside look on how we should and can combat racism, discrimination, xenophobia, homophobia, and anti-Semitism. Mental illness with the highest rate seen among people of African descent, especially women, is linked to racism, which is a source of colorism, xenophobia, discrimination, and similar issues. We have to stop focusing on the differences between us and instead come together as one, no matter race, sexual preferences, religion, or gender. So in order for us to constructively deal with these issues, we first have to acknowledge that mental illness does exist within the marginalized communities. We need to create allies between the different ethnicities and genders, because if I support you, you will support me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, to be followed by the Georgian Democracy Initiative.
The desire to be educated has been a fire burning in humans for generations. For African Americans, this began by learning the alphabet against slave masters' orders and has continued through the creation of historically black colleges and universities, which educated free slaves in a segregated United States. But in 2019, historically black colleges are still facing systemic discrimination. So I recommend that 1, the United States government increase the amount of annual funding given to black colleges. 2, the US government investigates the disproportionately high sanction rate against black colleges accreditation in comparison to predominantly white schools. And 3, for the OSCE to become invested in African American education, as we have the lowest education rates in America with a 9% college completion rate. The 101 black colleges in the US are the hubs of black scholarship and progress in my country. They are the nucleus of the civil rights movement and hold irreplaceable value to our understanding of history and the potential of the future. But in recent years, HBCUs have been struggling to stay open. Without funding, black colleges cannot keep their accreditation or their doors open. With the closing of every school, we lose over a century and a half of our history. We lose over 50% of all African American teachers, lawyers, and doctors. We lose 72% of African American PhDs. I am the product of an HBCU, a black college. Wiley College in Texas saw me when I did not see myself. And without my black college, I would not be here today speaking. Please consider my community and our schools in your policy decisions. All 101 of our schools have proven we make America innovative and productive. Please help us continue to thrive and help keep our fire burning. Thank you to ODIHR for bringing me here to advocate for my community and my people, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Georgian Democracy Initiative, to be followed by Salute and Misericord.
Distinguished guests, Madam Chair, my name is Marina Kapanadze, and I'm a human rights lawyer from Georgia representing the local non-governmental organization Georgian Democracy Initiative. As a representative of the young generation, I would like to emphasize in my speech the importance of education in combating all forms of discrimination. It is regrettable for me to say that today's educational system in Georgia fails to address the issues of tolerance and prohibition of discrimination properly. There are subjects in schools that include some issues of human rights and rule of law. However, public schools are not a place where children are taught about diversity and respect of individuals' rights. This happens because of the lack of teachers' capacity and low sensitivity towards the issues, because being a teacher is not a popular profession among young professionals, because state does not recognize the systematic problem and education has not become part of the state strategy. Moreover, the steady trend of loyalty towards the dominant religious institution, Orthodox Church, and the breach of the principle of secularism also hinders changes in education. These problems indeed contribute to deepening stereotypes and intolerant attitudes in society. It must be solved. So I would like to call OSCE participating states to make particular emphasis on the importance of education to combat racism, xenophobia, and discrimination. This could be done by supporting changes in the educational system of Georgia. Georgia's government should promote young professionals to start their careers in schools by giving them certain benefits and make teachers' job more popular. Schools should become oriented on developing of analytical and critical thinking among children, which is not the case right now. I would also like to urge OSCE and its member states to support informal educational initiatives aiming at the creation of a tolerant environment and to introduce capacity building activities for the youth and especially strengthening youngsters with a minority background. I hope in your support. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Salute and Misericord, to be followed by Roma youth organization Walk With Us, Fearin' America. That probably doesn't say America. I now turn to Roma youth organization Walk With Us. I now turn to Lithuanian Center for Human Rights, to be followed by Crimean Human Rights Group. Lithuanian Center for Human Rights.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I believe it is time to settle once and for all that in the countries where the numbers of reported hate-motivated crimes are the lowest, the issue is the most severe. Fewer reported hate crimes mean poor reporting mechanism, low public awareness, and weak governmental stance on hate crime. While some action has been taken by the Lithuanian government, there's still much to be improved. This is why I would like to propose 3 recommendations. Firstly, to the representatives of the Republic of Lithuania, I want to highlight the importance of allocating appropriate financial resources to NGOs and state institutions which are working to develop effective hate crime and hate speech reporting mechanisms, which are essential in addressing the issue. Secondly, to all participating states of the OSCE, to strengthen awareness-raising campaigns on hate crime and hate speech, which are crucial to improve recognition of such crimes. Thirdly, to the OSCE, to continue providing recommendations and monitoring participating states to ensure that they are addressing hate crime and hate speech with effective policies towards integration of vulnerable communities. Lastly, I think that it is extremely important to include young people into the conversation about hate crime and hate speech. We, the youth, share solidarity, culture, and digital space. We feel for each other like never before. We want our peers protected. As a white woman, I will most likely never experience hate speech or hate crime, but I want my Jewish, Roma, LGBTQ+ friends and peers from other groups that suffer for hate crime and hate speech in Lithuania and around the world to feel as safe as home as I do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Crimean Human Rights Group, to be followed by Center for Development of Humanistic Ecology and Culture.
The Crimean Human Rights Group has carried out a study which shows that the Russian Federation in occupied Crimea is carrying out a systematic policy of discrimination against citizens of Ukraine who do not have Russian documents. The text of the study, with reference to decisions of the occupying courts, can be found on the OSCE site. Let me come to the recommendation. A recommendation to the Russian Federation. This would be the most effective way of solving the problem, to stop the occupation of Crimea so that I could go back to Sevastopol. But if they don't go so far as to do that, they should make sure that in the occupied territory of Ukraine, it should be possible to guarantee civil, social, and economic rights of people who do not have documents of the Russian Federation. I mean, without these documents, you can't work, you can't obtain free medical care, because you don't have medical insurance. And the Russian authorities are also persecuting administratively these Ukrainian citizens who do not have Russian documents. They are slapped with fines. People who have lived there before the occupation are being expelled, even those who have solid social ties. In October of 2017, for instance, the Nakhimovsky Regional Court of Sevastopol decided that a resident of the city, Alexander Kasyanov, had to leave the country. He said that he had lived in Sevastopol for 10 years, long before the occupation, that he had a family there, that he was married, that he had minor children, and despite that, he had to pay a fine of 2,000 rubles, and he was deported. He was expelled from Crimea. So treating these Ukrainians as foreigners is a violation of international law. This should be perceived as discrimination on the basis of a political conviction, because these people don't have documents, because they don't think Russia should be issuing documents in Crimea. Thank you.
Now turn to the Center for Development of Humanistic Ecology and Culture.
Good afternoon, Madam Moderator, distinguished participants. My name is Marina Vaskanyan, and I represent the Center for the Development of Humanistic Ecology and Culture. I should like to thank you for giving me the chance to talk about discrimination today. I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that aside from the myriad types of discrimination which we've already mentioned, there are now new types cropping up, ones which haven't been mentioned yet today. Let me give you a few examples. Technological development, so-called frontier technologies, as the UN calls them, are being assessed purely as positives. Over the past few years, we've been discussing the digital divide, about the fact that some people don't have access to digital technologies and that this is considered a form of discrimination. But now we see the opposite. In fact, those who don't want to actively use digital technologies find themselves discriminated against. How did this occur? Well, for instance, if you refuse to hand over your personal data, big data, you might be prevented from accessing a wealth of services. For instance, if you don't want to submit your social media account data, or if you don't have a social media account, you might be discriminated against when applying for a job or for a visa. It might be difficult for you to get a visa from some states if you don't have a social media account. Turning now to the recommendations, we call on participating states to to pay attention to these new forms of discrimination, to gather information about this new phenomenon, and to come up with a position paper, an ODIHR position paper regarding human rights as we move on to confront the repercussions of technological progress. The full text of my statement will be available on the website, and we have a side event tomorrow. We'll discuss this topic further. You're all invited.
Thank you very much. I'll now turn to right of reply. Delegations will have 1.5 minutes for right of reply. The first delegation I have is Greece, to be followed by Uzbekistan. Greece, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. In reply to another repetitive statement by the same organization, I would like to recall that the 3 muftis in Thrace are selected through an open and all-inclusive process by a pool of distinguished and esteemed teachers of Islam, members of the minority, and are subsequently nominated to the mufti offices by the state. This process is fully consistent with the relevant international standards, as well as with the practice followed by other states, including Muslim ones. The so-called elected muftis are not officially recognized. Despite attitudes of evident disrespect to the existing legislation and an often provocative attitude, the state does not obstruct their activities, showing maximum tolerance and restraint. Recent measures adopted by the state have improved significantly the legal and operational framework of the mufti offices and have further strengthened the protection of the rights of persons belonging to the religious Muslim minority in Thrace. Finally, references to hate crimes against minority members are simply inaccurate. The region of Thrace is an example of harmonious and successful living together of a Christian majority and a Muslim minority in a country where the rule of law and human rights are fully respected. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Uzbekistan, to be followed by Bulgaria.
Well, I would like to take advantage of the right of reply in connection with a statement made by an NGO. One of the main priorities of the government of Uzbekistan is to develop a policy of tolerance, of humanism, and to ensure interethnic and interreligious stability and peace. We have about 2,500 religious organizations representing 16 different faiths. When it comes to faiths, we have full respect for all religious convictions and beliefs, and we believe that religion should not be used for destructive purposes. That equal rights should be guaranteed for both believers and non-believers. Insofar as wearing religious clothing in schools is concerned, and universities, schools and universities in our country have the right to impose their own dress codes that must be followed by anyone attending the institution in question. Thank you.
Very much. I now turn to Bulgaria, to be followed by France.
Right, Madam Moderator, allow me to use my right of reply with regard to some statements made during this session with regards to Bulgaria. Bulgaria has an adequate and solid legal framework for combating all cases of racism, intolerance, and xenophobia. The Bulgarian constitution prohibits racial discrimination in the most categorical manner. Series of measures have been undertaken to form positive attitudes towards citizens belonging to any group. Declarations against inciting hatred, violence, and discrimination are regularly expressed by politicians, the academic community, non-governmental organizations, and the media. Bulgaria took part in ODIHR's project building a comprehensive criminal justice response to hate crime for joint law enforcement personnel and prosecutors' efforts in tackling hate crimes. We also requested assistance from OSCE ODIHR to review the Bulgarian criminal code, primarily provisions pertaining to anti-discrimination, hate crime, and hate speech. Amendments to the criminal code are prepared, taking into consideration this legal opinion of ODIHR. The Bulgarian authorities also closely monitor all alleged manifestations of racism and discrimination against any person, and where necessary take steps to punish such acts. And last but not least, and this is very important, in June 2019, Ministry of Foreign Affairs held a joint workshop with ODIHR and FRA on ways to improve hate crimes recording and data collection. The political engagement was ensured by the participation of the Minister of Interior and Deputy Ministers of Justice and Foreign Affairs at the high-level panel of the discussions. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to France, to be followed by Austria.
Yes, I want to exercise the right of reply, responding to the coordination of associations and individuals for the freedom of conscience, the Russian Federation, and the Justice and Liberty for All coalition. First of all, the European Federation for Research on Sectarism, FECRIS, assists victims of sectarian discrimination and receives the support of our government. We have incessantly supported it. Second, we vigorously reject what was said about militant secularism in France. Religious neutrality of the state is a principle we hold very close to our hearts, and it makes no distinction between believers and non-believers. Our legislation guarantees the right to believe or not to believe, whilst enjoying safety. Any anti-Muslim, anti-Christian, racist or xenophobic speech is unacceptable. And the Minister of Internal Affairs recently said that we will not tolerate it. We will find all those responsible and hold them to account. Last but not least, in France, civil servants are duty-bound to exercise neutrality, including religious neutrality. Anyone who does not abide by this duty will be held accountable in line with the legislation in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Austria, to be followed by Belgium.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Since reference was made to the situation in Austria, I would like to add a few remarks. Austria is firmly committed to the fight against racism and the fight and prevention of intolerance and discrimination as enshrined inter alia in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the European Convention of Human Rights, and the Austrian Constitution. My delegation had actually planned to deliver a statement in this session spelling out specific measures taken towards this aim. Out of respect for the plenary of this meeting and the important topic discussed this morning, the Austrian delegation was, however, not able to spend the morning in line to secure a speaking slot. We will share our statement in writing and hope that it will still contribute to the discussions of this session. We will remain engaged on the topic, and as always, the Austrian delegation remains available for any follow-up with interested participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Belgium, to be followed by the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much, Moderator. I would like to respond to the civil society. Thank you very much to the representatives of civil society for their statements. The criticism was often constructive, and I would like to take advantage of this opportunity this afternoon for Belgium to exercise its right of reply to respond to some of the statements that have been made. Belgium believes very much in freedom of religion as a fundamental value in a democratic society, and that is fully protected by the Belgian Constitution. We certainly agree with the recommendations drafted by the OSCE in this regard, but also by other international organizations. Fundamental freedoms, including freedom of religion, are very much at the basis of our society. Now, the two regions of Belgium have introduced a ban on ritual slaughter unless the animal is made unconscious previously. The representatives of the Islamic and Israelite faiths have appealed to the Constitutional Court against this prohibition, and a preliminary question has also been put to the European Court of Human Rights. So the legal proceedings are underway. In the Brussels region, the third region of Belgium, no specific decision has been taken. Insofar as anti-Semitism is concerned, the Belgian authorities are conscious of this problem, and we seek to eliminate anti-Semitism through the creation of an observatory, and we have a monitoring monitoring unit that watches over the situation, gathers information on the subject, and seeks to combat anti-Semitism. Given the importance of this subject, Belgium has in fact participated in the project of ODIHR called Turning Words into Action, as in the process of implementing the practical guide that ODIHR has published in this area.
To be followed by Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. As a number of speakers mentioned my country, I'd like to exercise my right of reply. Life in the United Kingdom is based on fundamental values that have evolved over centuries, such as the rule of law, democracy, individual liberty, and the mutual respect, tolerance, and understanding of different faiths and beliefs. The government is committed to challenging all those who draw upon and promote ideologies that seek to normalise behaviours that run contrary to the shared values that underpin the UK's multicultural, multi-faith society. One of the greatest dangers we face is the threat of extremism from those who want to divide us. The government will not tolerate the efforts of extremists who seek the breakdown of our diverse neighbourhoods. In response to the point on Schedule 7 powers, Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act 2000 is a counter-terrorism port and border power. It enables an examining officer to stop, question, and when necessary detain and search a person travelling through a port to determine whether that person is or has been involved in the commission, preparation, or instigation of acts of terrorism. The decision to examine an individual under Schedule 7 is an operational decision undertaken independently by the police. In response to an earlier speaker, human rights are universal and apply equally to all without distinction. The promotion and protection of the rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people is a core part of the UK's human rights work. Within this context, a person's sexual orientation is not an illness to be cured. There is no evidence that this sort of so-called treatment is beneficial, and indeed it may well cause significant harm to some patients. In conclusion, the UK is fully committed to engaging with all actors to help build a more inclusive, tolerant and cohesive society, and to ensure that we live up to our OSCE commitments to combat all forms of discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I turn now to Ukraine, to be followed by Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Let me, Ukrainian of Russian origin, express this right of reply. Ukraine attaches great importance to the promotion of tolerance, mutual respect and understanding within the Ukrainian society and strongly condemns manifestations of any kind of intolerance and discrimination. The topic of preventing and combating discrimination is duly addressed by the national legislation, which provides for efficient system of legal protection, awareness-raising programs and statistical data collection. The overwhelming majority of religious and ethnic communities in Ukraine describe harmonious interfaith and inter-ethnic relations and conditions of non-discrimination. Neither Russian, nor Jewish, or any other origin is even a barrier to be part of my country's leadership. Ukraine is fully committed to further strengthening the implementation of relevant OSCE commitments. As for Russia claims, we would like to remind this delegation that Russia defies the provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice in connection with a case against the Russian Federation on violation of International Convention on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, in particular the ban on activities of Majlis of the Crimean Tatar people that has not been lifted. In Russia itself, there is a rise of anti-Semitism and xenophobia. According to SOVA Center, in 2018, at least 56 people became the victims of violence motivated by racist and neo-Nazi ideology. 4 of them were killed. As for the new canonic Orthodox Church of Ukraine, it was established last year under the decision of His All Holiness Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, and the respective provisions of the legislation were adopted by Ukrainian Parliament for all the religious minorities could express their right to change their affiliation and strengthen the religious freedom of the believers. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I turn now to Georgia, to be followed by Kyrgyzstan.
Thank you. Anti-discrimination law adopted in ensuring we all treated equally without discrimination based on sexual age, sexual orientation, colors, and etc. As regard to education, education is one of the fundamental rights of a human being and vital condition for sustainable development of the country. Ensuring qualified education, affordable the system, this is the main priority of the government of Georgia, and it's declared to be cornerstone of the country. Georgia has made significant progress in reforming the education system in the recent years. A number of reforms are underway. The Ministry of Education and Science of Georgia has developed a new strategy for education 2017-2021. The strategy describes how education systems should be organized and developed in order to contribute to the progress. As for the education, the standards is in the line of human rights strategy. Government has undertaken commitment to assure general education, including informal one. Furthermore, government of Georgia is committed to ensure quality education without discrimination, including of those belonging to vulnerable groups such as children and disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Kyrgyzstan to be followed by Canada.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. We would like to reply in relation to the statement by the Kyrgyz NGO, Birduyno. We would like to stress that the facts that have been announced have been of 3 years or 2 years old. Since then, the Kyrgyz authorities have taken proper measures to address the issues. However, I would like to bring to your attention that the first case of hooliganism has been registered, and the perpetrators have been brought to justice by the respective authorities. The second case of vandalism in the Russian cemetery has also been investigated. It has been founded that the school pupils, and unfortunately, has vandalized the Russian cemetery. And the third issue of funeral incident has also been addressed. The authorities have developed the temporary instructions on such kind of procedures. So we look forward to engaging with the civil societies in Kyrgyzstan to address such kind of issues in the future. I thank you, Madam.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Canada to be followed by Armenia.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. While Canada wasn't specifically named that I heard, I would just like to say 2 points on some of the issues raised that do affect Canada. One is the issue of anti-Black racism, which was mentioned by a number of speakers. And I just wanted to note that a critical component of Canada's anti-racism strategy is its recognition that anti-Black racism does exist in Canada and is particularly manifested in the legacy of ongoing social, economic, and political marginalization of African Canadians in society. In addressing this problem, Canada officially recognized the UN International Decade for People of African Descent, 2015 to 2024, and has committed 44 million Canadian dollars over 5 years to counter such racism in Canada. But we were, I don't know if pleased is the right word, but it is important to hear about these issues in this session. A number of speakers also raised the issue of LGBT people and approaches to those communities. So I would just like to reiterate that Canada advocates strongly in support of the rights of LGBTI persons, both at home and abroad. No one should be subjected to discrimination or violence because of their sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression, or due to their sex characteristics. And we encourage all states, all participating states, to support the work of local LGBTI organizations in order to further promote the welfare of LGBTI communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Armenia to be followed by Lithuania, which is the last right of reply I have on my list. Please, Armenia.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I would like to exercise my right of reply in response to the statement made by the delegation of Azerbaijan. The reference of Azerbaijan to Armenian church is erroneous and serves a putative link for Azerbaijani claims. Armenian church is older than Azerbaijan for 1,600 years. Every time Azerbaijan makes a reference to Armenian church, should remember this. Any attempt to present the history of Christianity by non-Christian identity in such a distorted manner shows that Azerbaijan encounters serious problem with its identity. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Lithuania to be followed by Germany.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. We would like to thank the Lithuanian Human Rights Center for the intervention on the challenges related to the hate crime problem, which is relevant for Lithuania as well as for the other OSCE countries. We do value these constructive critics and recommendations and thank for them. I would like to assure that the government of Lithuania makes its efforts in tackling the challenge of hate crime in our country. One of the examples is participation of Lithuanian law enforcement officials in the training on fighting hate crimes that is being offered by ODIHR. Also, strengthening dialogue with civil society is very important for us. Given this opportunity, I would also like to thank ODIHR for providing an opportunity for participating states to benefit from its important trainings on fighting hate crime as well as in other areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I turn now to Germany, to be followed by the Czech Republic.
Vielen Dank. Ich möchte erwidern auf diejenigen.
Thank you very much. We want to exercise our right of reply in response to a number of the statements made, specifically as regards Scientologists. I have 3 points to make. First of all, the incident in Munich. This was a private company, and in fact the government has nothing to do with private companies hiring employees. We suggest that the individuals in question petition the courts. Next, judgments handed down by German courts regarding Scientologists. We have independent courts. Therefore, the government will not comment on court decisions. And third, we have no anti-Scientologist policies in Germany. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I turn now to the Czech Republic, to be followed by Azerbaijan, which is the last right of reply I have on my list.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I would like to briefly reply to the statement of Religious Society, Path of Guru Jara. The Czech Republic is fully committed to the respect for human rights and the principle of rule of law, including the right of free trial. The freedom of religion and belief is guaranteed by the Czech Constitution. This particular issue remains subject to ongoing court proceedings. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I turn now to Azerbaijan, which is the last right of reply.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. As response to the representative of Armenia, I would like to note that within the framework of Baku process, which is an initiative directed to intercultural dialogue, Azerbaijan hosted many international conferences and forums. For instance, in 2010, Azerbaijan hosted Baku Summit of World Leaders. During this summit, Armenian Gregorian Church head Garegin visited Baku, and he was in the Armenian church, and he was surprised seeing that church is reconstructed. However, all mosques and other religious objects of Muslims in Nagorno-Karabakh region of Azerbaijan during the occupation was destroyed by Armenian forces. As for Albanian churches, they were unfairly forfeited by the Armenian government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As I see no other delegation wishes to exercise its right of reply, I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of our introducers, thank all of our participants, everybody who spoke. I think this was a very robust and useful session, and kindly thank our interpreters for their work and going a few minutes over to accommodate us. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.